Chapter 486. The Crimson Banner Riders were torn apart in the forest, and the crimson-red swallowtail flags fell one after another. Lord Paulus' side was completely silent. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. This is the mercenaries of Lopez mentioned in the intelligence report. They actually endured until now. The old knight closed his eyes, and his wrinkled face revealed a deep sense of fatigue. Lord Wade was a young man he admired, but there was no room for regret in war. Erwin had already lost too much blood. When he opened his eyes again, there was only a cold determination left in them. Since the rebels had revealed their trump card, the outcome of the battle had already been decided. Let the Knights of Ranner go forth and add to your glory. He waved his hand, as if he had completely handed over the victory to the youths. The knights and silver-ranked warriors from Ranner cheered in unison. However, the cheers did not evoke any joy in Lord Paulus' heart. Erwin had already fallen asleep, and just like him, the old man's gaze pierced through the dusk, as if he had already seen the thick darkness. When was there ever a time when even victory could not bring forth the color of hope? His eyes could only see the thick color of blood. What went wrong? The knights are moving. A cold voice rang in Yuta's ears. She turned around and saw Medicia's unchanging expression. The little elven girl was quite cute when she pulled a long face. She even had the aura of an elven royal, a princess general. Yuta nodded. Victory and defeat were decided in a single thought, and even she could see it clearly. However, she could not see the opportunity for victory. The previous battle had consumed a lot of her stamina, and even in front of the fairy princess, she could not maintain her composure. Just like the defensive line, anyone could see that it was on the verge of collapse. However, Yuta could not help but look at Medicia in front of her in confusion. She wondered if it was the pride of the elves, or some unknown confidence that supported this little girl to be able to maintain her composure in such a situation. But where did her confidence come from? The female mercenary captain panted slightly. For the first time, she did not care about the anxious eyes of her own people behind her. She turned around and asked piously, "How should we deal with it?" A woman's pride forced her to not lower her head. She wanted to see where this general's confidence came from. She was clearly a child, so how could she understand everything on the battlefield? Did this elven girl really understand what she was facing? Yuta was very suspicious. However, Medicia was very clear-headed. "Blow," she said. Yuta looked at the fairy princess in disbelief. Even though she was covered in silver armor, she still looked like a childish general. What about Madara? Blowing the horn was a signal to mobilize the subterrane dwellers, but it was no secret that the subterrane dwellers were the last of Madara's forces. Both sides on the battlefield knew this. The subterrane dwellers were the last reserves of both sides on the battlefield, and whoever sent in their reserves first would lose the war. Medicia looked at her and calmly grabbed the spear beside her. "Prepare the horses for me. I want to lead them myself." Yuta was suddenly speechless. She grabbed Medicia's shoulder and said, "My people can't die with you." "What about you?" Medicia tilted her head and asked. Yuta took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll go with you, little girl." Medicia smiled. When the long horn sounded in the forest, it was like an ancient ballad. Both sides of the battle seemed to feel the vastness of the ancient forest. Dragon horns and trombones. Lord Paulus suddenly felt that time had turned back, and he had returned to the days of war. On the battlefield of the Holy War, there was only blood for blood. The old alliance was no longer there. It was a war without glory, but it was a medal of honor for the veterans. Lord Paulus licked his dry lips. "It's the subterrane dwellers. The subterrane dwellers have appeared. Are they going to fight to the death? These rebels are really worthy of respect. Where did they come from? Yes, where did these people come from?" The old knight suddenly felt a little doubtful. These were not ordinary rebels. These were the best of Erwin's warriors. But why did the best of Erwin's people always have his own blood flowing in them? The old knight suddenly had the desire to meet the young man called Brando. He couldn't help but think that perhaps one day, the Erwin's people would be united again. But who would be the one to make this happen? Would it be the dukes in the north, or would it be the isolated princess? Lord Paulus felt that he might not be able to see that day. He closed his eyes, as if trying to find the footprints of King Eric in his dreams. "Sir?" the surrounding knight asked hesitantly. "Inform Madara." Lord Paulus's closed eyes never opened again. The old knight answered tiredly. The knight nodded and retreated. But at this time there was a sudden cheer in the forest. "What's wrong?" Lord Paulus squinted his eyes and looked over. His personal knight also turned around at the same time. The cheers came from the camp of the Mage Corps. Those guys seemed to be celebrating something. The old knight frowned unhappily. "It seems that the wizards have discovered that the forest on the other side is not entirely real. A large part of the forest behind is an illusion. They have been trying to find a way to get rid of this illusion. They finally found a way just now." A messenger immediately replied. Lord Paulus snorted softly. A group of 30 mages did not do anything in the previous battle, causing him to lose a lot of talented young men. Although those guys in robes had explained that it was because they were fighting against a wizard in the opposing camp who was far more powerful than them, the old knight always thought that it was just an excuse. A wizard who was more powerful than them? Wouldn't that be a gold-ranked wizard? How could there be such a talent in the rebel army? Sure enough, those guys who were mumbling could not be trusted. Lord Paulus couldn't help but think. But at this time they were still doing something important. Even though he suspected that they were trying to take the credit, it was not convenient for him to say anything. He just nodded to show that he understood. However, he did not expect the wizards to act so quickly. Soon, the sound of chanting could be heard from the forest below. Following that, a huge magic fluctuation caused even the ordinary soldiers in the forest to feel their hair stand on end. If even the ordinary people could feel the magic fluctuation, it naturally could not escape the eyes of a true professional spellcaster. In fact, when the wizards on Count Ranner's side cast their spells, the Shire had already sensed the commotion on the other side. However, the young wizard looked at the acolyte who came to ask for his instructions and shook his head. "Don't worry about it. Let them dismantle it." "Let them dismantle it?" The acolyte was puzzled. "Nonsense, that thing is used to scare people. What's the use of it when the war has already progressed to this stage? Those idiots like to waste their magic. Just let them be. How low do you have to be to go crazy with those idiots?" The Shire immediately showed an expression of disappointment. He tapped the acolyte's forehead. "Wizards need to use their brains more in a battle. Do you understand?" The acolyte was scolded badly and hurriedly nodded. In fact, the Shire was definitely not the best choice as a mentor. At least in terms of patience, this young wizard's acolyte could not even compare to his master. He then looked at all the wizards and apprentices in robes below and shook his head. "Don't say I didn't warn you. Save as much mana as you can to prepare for the final battle. I didn't bring you here to let you die here." "Of course," the Shire shrugged. "If a person wants to die of stupidity, then there's nothing I can do about it." As soon as he finished speaking, a much louder cheer came from the forest. Everyone turned to look at the north bank of the Gree River. This time the cheers came from Count Ranner, Lord Paulus, the Grizzly Bear territory, and the ordinary soldiers of Crus. Even the Highlanders were cheering. This was because the illusion of the forest was disappearing. This was good news for everyone in Count Ranner's army. It seemed to indicate the arrival of the final victory. Their enemies had lost their last barrier. Tarkus and his Black Knight Guard stood in the forest like shadows. Their golden pupils shone with a cold light, as if the outcome of this battle, or even the battle itself, had nothing to do with them. Behind them were thousands of undead soldiers. As they did not need to breathe, the entire army was silent like a steel wall. The one-eyed general's gaze fell on the subterranean dwellers who were covered in thick armor. "Subterranean dwellers," he said as he put down the gauntlet and turned around. "This is the trump card of those humans. Let's go, I want a Madara-style victory for the Emperor." The Black Knight unsheathed their shiny scimitars and replied in a low voice, "With the will of the Mercury staff." But it was at this moment that the sound of a horn rang out from the forest. It was a long sound that lingered in the forest. Tarkus stopped. He seemed to be listening to the horn. "It's the assault horn. They dare to attack." Lord Paulus suddenly shut his mouth. The cheering soldiers of Count Ranner also shut their mouths, because behind the melting forest, they actually saw something that shouldn't belong there. "All troops pay attention. An unfamiliar army has appeared on the left flank. The enemy did not respond to the signal. It might be the enemy. The shouts of the messengers echoed one after another. When Brando parted the layers of branches in front of him, he saw such a scene. Rows of elven archers on Pegasi appeared on both sides of him. He turned around and glanced at Quinn. Where do you think their great chieftain is? You humans should call him a general, right? I think he's on that mountain. I'm just saying that because when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Brando looked at the tree elf leader in surprise. We don't have a great chieftain either. You're talking about the orcs. Quinn gritted his teeth. Something like that. Brando shrugged as he looked at the undulating forest and the river Gree that was almost dyed red. But I don't think Lord Paulus is stupid enough to expose himself in such an obvious place. That might be the base of one of his night lords. He thought for a moment. But it's something like that. As a surprise, I think it's enough. Brando turned his head again. Scouts, have you cleared the enemy's whistle? Yes, a centaur immediately replied. But my lord. But. We found a hunter's hut. A hunter's hut? P.S. I still have a cold and I even had a few nosebleeds yesterday. What a tragedy. Anyway, it's 2 chapters again. Students, keep voting, keep up the good work, and I'll update 2 chapters again tomorrow. Also, to answer a few questions. Some of the students in the comments section said that the background and setting are difficult to understand. How should I put it? As a self-created world, there must be a lot of background and culture. If I were to write these into a book, I'm afraid it would take up to 1,000,000 words. First of all, you won't have the time to read it all. Second, I'm sure I won't be able to handle it. Rather than that, it's better to spread it out bit by bit. If you feel that you don't understand some of the settings, you can choose to skip them and just treat them as background. I'll also explain the important settings in detail. You may not understand them at first, but you'll understand them after a while. Second, Freya's sword isn't the real Amber Sword. It's just a name. Maynard hopes to use the sword's will to fight against Erwin's fate. Also, yesterday on Tieba, someone asked if Maynard had transmigrated. I didn't answer this question because I thought that many people would want to know the answer to this question. I won't say much about the plot, but I can tell you with certainty that she didn't transmigrate. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 487. Most of the residents in remote areas such as Tanajul and Usong did not live near the city. Even in Wone, the more prosperous the area, the higher the degree of urbanization. Probably because of trade and other reasons, there were a large number of craftsmen, monks, artists, city officials, and their relatives, as well as people who relied on these people to live in the city. But in Tanajul, the situation was reversed. There were many scattered settlements in the wilderness. Farms were scattered around the edges of the forest, and there were hunters' huts in the hills. The centaurs discovered this situation, and there was a family living in the hut. They were afraid that they were Count Randner's scouts, so they brought them along. The leaves on the trees rustled softly. The centaur warriors were tall and strong, with reddish-brown muscles and purple and white battle tattoos on their cheeks and shoulders. They brought along trembling men and women with them, as well as their children. Their clothes were tattered, and their black hair was greasy and tangled. They looked like refugees. Brando glanced down the mountain. The forest was as dark as ink, and flags of different colors intertwined with each other, but the sounds of battle were silenced. The entire battlefield came to a standstill because of their sudden appearance. He noticed that the soldiers of Krus were secretly adjusting their formation, and the grayish-green nobles' private soldiers were faintly discernible in the forest. But he did not mind and turned back. They are not scouts, just refugees. My lord, we. The man's eyes flashed with fear. Refugees who were caught by the nobles were usually beheaded. There were many headless corpses on the road from Dowling to Summer. Most of them were refugees while the rest were bandits. Who are you? The child broke free from his mother's pale hands and asked loudly. The sudden appearance of the army on the flanks caused Lord Paulus to feel uneasy. However, when he heard that there were only a few hundred of them, he heaved a sigh of relief. His index finger tapped on the smooth hilt of his sword as he turned around and asked, "Any response from the scouts?" "No." Lord Paulus nodded. "Only a few hundred people dared to appear?" The old knight heard the knights beside him discussing in a relaxed tone. The soldiers seemed to be mocking the enemy for overestimating their strength. Even though an arrogant army was bound to lose, there was no general who did not like a confident army. He was very satisfied with the morale of his subordinates. The enemy's reinforcements seemed to have become a laughing stock. The reinforcements are stopping. Haha, he's probably considering whether to retreat or flee. Coward, if you had caught us off guard when you first appeared, you might have been able to catch us off guard. What a waste of time. To be able to circle around our flank, they must be quite capable. That's because Cruss is too incompetent. Lord Paulus couldn't help but shake his head. Who would consider the enemy? His subordinates were a little too arrogant. He took a deep breath and replied, "If there's no response, then they're enemies. Have the Cruss men stop them. They've already lost enough face. The morale of the army could be used. Then let's go." The old knight pulled down his mask and stood up from the rock. His attendants had already brought his warhorse to him, and his knights were already ready to go. Even the slightest change on the battlefield could not change his decision. Although Lord Paulus was cautious, he had the decisiveness of a general. He nodded to the attendant, and the metal armor clanked as it rubbed against each other. The attendant in leather armor picked up the horn hanging at his waist and blew it. A clear battle cry pierced through the forest. Then countless soldiers walked out of the forest. They were dressed in red and blue battle robes, with iron helmets on their heads and long swords on their waists. They held eagle shields in one hand, and their iron gauntlets made cracking sounds as they stepped on the dead wood. The small groups of soldiers converged into a torrent, as if they had filled up all the gaps in the forest. The noble's private army was arranged in a few huge square formations. Like water flowing slowly through the battlefield, the scattered arrows were thrown into the formation. Even if one of the soldiers fell, the soldiers behind would immediately fill the gap. The enemies in front of them seemed endless, and it made them feel helpless. The army was approaching. The mercenaries who were still resisting in the forest couldn't help but put down the bows in their hands. The appearance of an army of tens of thousands was enough to make the earth tremble. Everyone swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Medisha was dressed in silver armor and sat on her unicorn. Her helmet was sealed, and only her eyes, small nose and mouth were exposed. The fairy princess pursed her lips and held onto her long shuttle as she watched the scene in front of her without saying a word. Behind her were Yuta, Rabin, and nearly 1,000 subterrane dwellers. The subterrane dwellers were hunched over, covered in black and spiked armor. They held huge spears in their hands like war monsters. However, this army did not block the path of Count Randner's army. Medisha was silently watching the battle. Yuta did not understand. "Are we not going to attack? They are not our enemy, Yuta. I never said that our target was not Madara." Medisha looked at the distant mountain and replied, "But they can't stop us." The female mercenary leader looked at the approaching army with slight nervousness. "My lord has his own plans." Medisha looked back at her and smiled slightly. Her calm eyes were filled with unquestionable trust. "You're too nervous. My lord doesn't have many people with him." Yuta looked at Medisha strangely. "Enough," Medisa said. "I'm the main commander of this reserve force. First of all, I have to obey the tactical arrangements. My lord said he can do it, so I have to believe in his judgment. Our target is Madara." "I think I'm crazy." Yuta shook her head and muttered. Medisha smiled. "Thank you for accompanying me, Yuta. You're just a little girl." Yuta sighed and thought of her sister. She touched her sword and suddenly felt that her hand was a little cold. Brando looked at the thin boy. The mother ran over and protected her child in fear. She raised her head and looked at him with pleading eyes. "My lord, the enemy is moving." At this time, one of the mercenaries said. Brando nodded and looked back. "I'm your rightful lord. No matter if you're refugees or my people, as long as you live in Tanajil, I will protect you. Just remember this, and that's enough." After that, he pulled the reins and was about to leave. But at this time, to everyone's surprise, the child loudly retorted, "Liar, you're all bad people." Brando was startled and could not help but stop. "Father said that if you weren't here, there wouldn't be a war." "My lord." The man pulled his son with an uneasy expression. He Brando shook his head and looked back at the people he brought out of the Black Forest. Everyone was also looking at him. The tree elves, the centaurs, the druids, and the human mercenaries. Brando nodded at them, then jumped off the horse and pulled out his sword in front of everyone's eyes. The poor woman suddenly let out a frightened scream, but Brando walked to her side and held her skinny hand. He gently shook his head and comforted her. "It's okay, don't worry." The woman and the man looked at him nervously. He turned back and patted the little boy's face. "You're a little man, let me ask you a question." The little boy stared at him. "If one day someone wanted to take your parents away from you, what would you do?" "If they dare, I'll beat them," the little boy answered confidently. "Well said," Brando praised. "Then let me ask you, little man, if one day someone wants to take you away from me, take away this country, guess what I'll do?" The little boy looked at him with a puzzled expression. "I'll beat them up too." Brando smiled faintly. He got up on his horse and pointed his sword forward. Count Randner's army was moving in the forest, but the two armies were still looking at each other from afar. The situation in Tanajul, and even the whole of Erewhon, seemed to be gathering into this final confrontation. Who will be able to change the fate of the kingdom? Brando looked forward but turned his head. "So you all heard it? Beat them up." The mercenaries roared in response. Beat them up. The centaur's blood was boiling. This was the life they pursued. They chased after glorious battles until the last drop of blood was shed. Perhaps war itself was meaningless, but the most precious thing between faith and hope was always worthy of respect. The tree elves placed their bows in front of their chests and sang the war song that was widely spread between the humans and elves in the early years. The eagle Zhongyu bow and crossbow high, light triumphs over darkness, hope protects faith. It was an ancient song that was spread before the War of the Holy Saints. At that time, the intelligent beings of the land were still able to unite against the dark dragon and sign a sacred and solemn oath. But in the blink of an eye, 1,000 years had passed. Brando and Quinn looked at each other and smiled. "How do we fight?" the leader of the tree elves asked. "You will stop Count Randner's army," Brando replied casually. "Since Lord Paulus wants Crust to stop me, I will crush his left wing." These nobles always like to look down on people, and I hope they will remember this lesson from today onwards. "You alone?" Quinn looked at him in surprise. "Me alone." Brendel shook his head with a smile. He turned his head, put his index finger and thumb to his lips, and blew a long whistle. The whistle traveled far and wide in the dark coniferous forest, and everyone on both sides could hear it. The forest suddenly became quiet. Suddenly, a wolf's howl could be heard from afar. A moment later, howls echoed through the forest. The distant howls seemed to be approaching at an astonishing speed. In just a moment, the howls seemed to be right next to their ears. The earth began to tremble as if 10,000 horses were galloping. Lord Paulus pulled on the reins of his warhorse and stopped. The old knight's expression changed slightly under his iron mask. All the knights around him also stopped and turned their heads towards the direction of the howls. It was a pack of wolves, and not just any wolves. The people who lived at the edge of the Black Forest naturally knew what kind of creature the howls came from. Black wolves. The first to panic were the mountain people. They had lived in the wilderness for generations, and there were countless legends about these terrifying creatures. There was only one thing they could think of at this moment: the wolf tide. "The wolf tide is coming." The old knight's face turned pale. Quinn looked at Brando, who was standing alone in the midst of the galloping wolves like a knife. It was as if he was looking at a mythical wolf herder. Brando turned his head and smiled at him. "Is that enough?" Quinn did not say a word. He raised his bow and gestured for the tree elves to attack. In an instant, countless Pegasi soared into the sky from the forest. Author's note: my cold is slightly better, but I have to go out to get some medicine, so I'll stop here for today. Tomorrow Brando will start his killing spree. Maybe I'll give him a little boost. Also, those comments in the book review section that said, "I'll combine my breasts, please have some self-respect." Can you be any more vulgar? Brando felt that the lion heart was indeed a divine weapon, and the lion heart was indeed a fantasy weapon. As for the reason, I'll leave it to you to guess. Also, Mothering, I found out that you were talking bad about me in the book review section. The Nightwing staff is a bug in itself. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 488. The Black Wolf Overlord was running at the front. Its fur was black and as hard as steel spikes. Its eyes seemed to be burning with green flames, making it look like a demon that had just been born in hell. As it ran, its 4 feet landed on the ground, and its sharp claws and teeth shone with a cold light. It ran wildly on the withered leaves in the forest. The soldiers could not catch up with its speed. They could only watch as it ran from another mountain to the valley, and then from the valley to the forest on the other side. All the arrows landed behind it, and they could only watch as it approached. The herald trembled as he ordered the soldiers to put down their spears. However, Krus's noble soldiers retreated in waves, and visible ripples appeared on the battlefield. Krus and his knights were supposed to supervise the battle, but the calamity of wolves was the nightmare of Tanajil and the people of the forest for generations. The dark shadows in the forest were the signs of the end of the world. The knights' faces turned pale. Why did we encounter these things? Krus cursed. Krus's soldiers were still able to hold their ground, but the mountain people were even more afraid of the calamity of wolves. Some of the tribes at the back had secretly dispersed, and the tribes at the front were also in a mess. This was a fear that had been ingrained in their hearts since childhood. Once it spread, it would be like a disaster falling from the sky. Even the bravest warriors would lose their courage and throw away their armor. The black wolves were less than 100 steps away from the front of the formation. The archers' projectiles had no effect on them. Krus was a gold-ranked warrior, and his eyesight was excellent. He could see that the soft arrows could not even penetrate the fur of the black wolves. The army behind him was moving forward. The Grey Bear Lord was cunning and indecisive. He could not rely on him. He could only order his soldiers to move forward. Men could not outrun the black wolves, and neither could horses. Krus had lived in the south for 30 years, and he knew this very well. The cold air in the forest was oppressive, but the coldness in the heart was even colder. There were only a few hundred black wolves, and they looked like colts. They were so fast that it seemed like there was no end to them. His palms were sweating, and it condensed on the hilt of his sword. It was as if his breathing had stopped. However, a young knight ran out of the forest first. Brando raised his head. Krus first thought that it was one of his scouts, but then he realized that it was not. The young man raised his head and looked at him. The two of them looked at each other from a distance, but he felt as if he had been completely seen through. Who are you? Krus had a bad feeling. Lord Krus, do you still dream of turning back on the battlefield of Canner? You lost your honor on the battlefield, and I've brought it back to you. Brando's words made him cry out loudly. His face was deathly pale, as if he had fallen into the deepest nightmare. Lord Krus pointed a trembling finger at Brando and stammered, You, 20 years ago, he abandoned his comrades on the battlefield and fled. He thought that no one knew about it, but today a young man had exposed him. Brando didn't say anything. He didn't mean to mock the other party. Just as he said, he only wanted to bring back the lost glory for the other party. Behind him, the pack of black wolves surged out like a tide. Horses and wolves were creatures that opposed each other, but Brando, who was riding on a horse, was able to stand tall in the middle of the pack of wolves without moving at all. This strange scene made people feel even more terrified. Then the black wolf collided with the noble soldiers of Krus. It was as if black paint had blended into the gray-green battle line. At that moment, time seemed to slow down. The spears that were placed horizontally on the body of the black wolf, but even the metal spears couldn't penetrate the hard fur of the black wolf, let alone the rock deck below. The spears were bent and cracked along the grain. Crack! 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 The broken wood chips caused a cloud of smoke to rise from the first line of defense. Most of the noble soldiers of Krus were only at the white rank. Most of the officers in the infantry were only at the iron rank, so how could they be a match for the silver-ranked black wolves? The first line of defense, formed by thousands of infantrymen, was pierced through in an instant, turning into a sieve full of holes. The human soldiers began to retreat, mixed with cries and screams. Lord Krus seemed to have just woken up from his nightmare. He immediately ordered his knight to stabilize the second line of defense. The knight's strength was at the silver rank. As soon as they entered the formation, They took over the command and tried to stabilize the morale of the soldiers with the help of the common soldiers. However, the Krus formation had already begun to collapse towards the center. The wolves tore a huge hole in the middle, and the center of the hole was pointed towards Lord Krus, who was at the top of the mountain. Perhaps it was because of Brando's words. The knight of Count Randner did not retreat. He held his long sword and silently watched the development of the battle below. The knight's orders were to enter the two flanks, and the two flanks that suffered the least attacks from the black wolves quickly stabilized. The Krus soldiers gradually realized that the number of black wolves was actually not that high. After a commotion, the soldiers began to attempt to surround them from the back. Did they give up on the main formation? What a bold decision. Brando raised his head and looked at Lord Krus from afar. The distance between them was less than a kilometer. This distance was neither close nor far in the battlefield of Wound, and it could be said that it was a test of the courage and wisdom of the commanders on both sides. Lord Krus stood there motionlessly, looking at him. He actually wanted to use himself as a stake to surround him and the wolves. Such courage did not surprise Brando, because he had already expected this. In just a short moment, the wolves were completely surrounded. 200 black wolves and more than 100 iron-ranked shadow rock beasts were facing 10 times the number of human soldiers. Retreating was no longer an option. Both sides were competing to see who would achieve victory first. Brando raised Haurangaya. The wolves automatically opened up a path for him. The Pegasus he was riding on seemed to feel its master's urging and began to accelerate. His mount was not an ordinary Pegasus, but a gift from the tree elves. This Pegasus was a spirit of nature with the silver blood flowing through its veins. It was the descendant of the holy horse Kalaner, a silver seed, a mythical creature on the same level as the unicorn. It was stronger and faster than the average Pegasus, and it had the ability to control plants and the wind. Brendel was riding on the wings of the wind, flying with the wind. Like an elongated white line, there were no more wolves in front of him. Instead, there were pale-faced human soldiers with spears in their hands. Brando drew an arc with the sword in his hand, as if 7 swords had appeared at the same time. Clang! 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 More than 10 spears were sent flying by him. Brando stretched out his left hand and shouted, "Gale, grant me authority." This was the elementalist's second circle wind spell, Beam Current. The burst of air erupted in a scattered manner, creating a hurricane behind Brando. He moved forward and the wall of wind also moved forward. The soldiers in front of him were pushed away, forming a hemispherical human wall. The human wall dispersed in midair, and these unlucky fellows fell far into the crowd. The Black Wolf Lord walked side by side with its master. It was born with the strength of a peak silver tier, and after its stone transformation, its shoulder armor, forehead, and back grew a ribbon-like rock plate, greatly increasing its strength and defense. At this moment it was already close to the early gold tier. Ordinary soldiers could not get close to it at all. Its howl alone was enough to make a group of people weak in the knees. One man and one wolf, in the blink of an eye, opened up a 50-meter-long path in the crowd. Behind them the pack of black wolves followed, widening the passage. But 2 knights came out from the side, one on the left and one on the right, trying to block Brando's path. Brando waved Haurangaya in his hand, and with a flash of sword light, the upper body of the 2 knights and the head of the war horse flew high into the air. An instant kill of a silver tier. At this moment, all the nobles who were rushing forward were terrified and stopped in their tracks. This was a gold tier battle, and it was no longer a battle that mortals like them could participate in. Brendel urged his horse forward again, and the enemy soldiers actually retreated to open up a path for him. It was a strange sight, as though they had switched sides on the battlefield. Lord Krus's face also changed. Such a young gold tier. He was definitely one of Erewhon's most talented geniuses. And this was not even the early gold tier. Seeing Brando's elemental domain shining with light, Lord Krus felt the hope in his heart turn to ice. What the hell is going on, these rebels? But Brando saw that Lord Krus still had no intention of moving, and he understood. He looked around, and saw that there were 2 gold tier fluctuations in the crowd. Sure enough, there was an ambush, and there were more than 2 gold tiers. He looked at the 2 swordsmen who were charging towards him. They were both at the beginning of the gold level, unfamiliar faces. They were either secretly trained or hired. Of course, the great aristocrats were rich. Brando did not show any signs of nervousness. He continued to charge forward, raising his sword and slashing at the first gold-tier swordsman charging at him. He did not hold back in the slightest as he charged forward with his horse. His sword was like a shooting star, moving forward with an indomitable will. The gold-tier swordsman from the Randner family was scared out of his wits. He had never seen such a crazy person, who completely gave up on defense even though he knew it was a 1 versus 2 battle. This sword strike was clearly, "I'll give you a stab even if I have to give up my life." It was not a technical move, but it was enough to make people go crazy. But of course, he did not want to die together with Brando, but the sword was too fast and he could not dodge it in time. He could only raise his sword to parry. He was already extremely depressed in his heart. Originally, he had taken the initiative to attack first, but he was suppressed by the other party's crazy fighting style. He could only hope that his companion would be able to catch Brando's desperate attack. They had worked together for many years, and would not let go of such an obvious opportunity. However, what happened next caught him by surprise. Brando's sword clashed with his sword, and the huge force almost broke his hand. The swordsman staggered backward, cursing in his heart as he tried to regain his balance. But when he looked up, he saw that Brando did not seem to need to find his center of gravity again, and the sword was already coming at him perfectly. The swordsman was shocked out of his wits. Oh, to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 489. How is this possible? The gold-ranked swordsman's eyes nearly popped out of their sockets when he saw Brendel's attack. Brendel had used up all of his strength to execute a perfect attack, and if a normal person did not manage to land a blow like that, they would be in a state of paralysis. But Brendel did not even bother to pull back his sword, and immediately followed up with another attack. No matter how he looked at it, it was a strike that used up all of his strength. There was almost no difference between this strike and the previous one. It was a complete reversal of the laws of physics. It was as if two people had struck out at the same time. The gold-tier swordsman from the Diener family could not comprehend it, and he did not need to. If he did not raise his sword to block the strike, he would have to say goodbye to this world. However, he could imagine that if he tried to block the strike, he would be smashed to the ground. He did not even have the time to regain his balance. But he could not care about that at this moment. The gold-tier swordsman from the Diener family wanted to cry, but no tears came out. He did not know what was going on and could only raise his sword. Then with a loud bang, Brendel was sent flying along with his sword. It was as if he was swatting a dead fly as he fell to the ground. The two strikes were completed in an instant. In the eyes of the bystanders, Brando seemed to have transformed into two figures and slapped the swordsman to the ground as if he was teaching a child a lesson. It was at this moment that the swordsman's companion arrived. In fact, the second swordsman who had just arrived was also going crazy. If it was any other time, the difference of a few tenths of a second would not have much of an effect. But this time, when the second swordsman arrived, he discovered that Brendel's third sword was already on its way to his fallen comrade. It was as though the second sword had not returned, and the third sword was already on its way. If he could, the swordsman from Count Eyre's family wanted to bang his head on the ground and bawl out loud, "This bastard is using a cheat." But he did not have the time to do so. He realized that if he did not act now, his companion would really die. Even though he was also a gold-tier swordsman, he did not even have the chance to retaliate before he was forced to retreat. This was unacceptable. He immediately drew his sword. In theory, Brando's 3 consecutive strikes meant that he had given up all his defense and attacked his companion with all his might. Even if he did not seize the opportunity to seize the opportunity, he would at least be able to achieve his goal of attacking Brando. However, the swordsman from the Diener family vomited blood when he saw Brando completely ignoring him and stabbing his sword into the heart of the swordsman, who was lying on the ground with an expression of disbelief. The expression on the face of the swordsman saying, "Do you hate me that much? Do you not care for your own life?" But at the same time, he saw Brendel's sword slashing towards him. A perfect slash with all his strength. This is impossible. The swordsman from the Diener family almost dropped his sword and screamed as he clutched his head. But regardless of whether it was possible or not, Brando's sword accurately struck his blade. What happened after that was a carbon copy of what happened before. 6 sword strikes in a row, and 2 gold-ranked swordsmen were easily killed by Brendel in a matter of seconds. In fact, it was not as easy for a normal person to kill a dog. For a moment, the entire left wing of the battlefield was silent. Brando pulled his sword out from the corpse of the second swordsman, and wiped it on the latter's clothes before looking around. Wherever he looked, the noble soldiers of the Krus family were so frightened that they retreated like a receding tide. Their fear was contagious, and it quickly turned into a message of despair. Brando moved forward, and thousands of soldiers screamed as if they had seen a ghost. The people at the front could not take it anymore. They threw down their weapons and ran away. At first, only a small portion of the soldiers were in front of Brando, but it destroyed the last of the Krus family's confidence, and the soldiers began to scatter in large numbers. With one person as the center, they began to scatter. On the battlefield, Lord Krus's personal guards and his knights were the ones who held the fort. Brando was still looking at him from afar, but the distance between them was less than 100 meters. However, both sides did not seem to have the intention to continue fighting. Brando stood under the encirclement of the wolves, and he saw the human knight in front of him opening a path for him. Behind him was Lord Krus, who was fully equipped and mounted on his horse. In fact, Lord Krus knew that he had lost, but he did not admit defeat. This knight, who had abandoned his comrades on the battlefield in Cantner, was now sitting on his horse with a longsword in his hand. He ordered everyone to stay, but he wanted to fight Brando alone. He held the longsword in his right hand, sat on the horse's back, and stretched out his left hand towards Brando. Brando looked at him and understood what he meant. This was a challenge. He nodded. Lord Krus raised his longsword and shouted, "Erwin, your sword will always shine." The wolves also separated. Brando rode forward, but his speed was not fast. Lord Krus rushed down the mountain, and Brando slowly ran up the mountain from the foot of the mountain. The two crossed paths. Brando directly transferred the longsword from his right hand to his left hand, and used Bahamut's claw to grab Lord Krus's longsword. Without any fancy moves, he stabbed the longsword with his left hand into Lord Krus's chest. With a bang, the huge force knocked Lord Krus off his horse. This veteran of the November War rolled a few times on the ground, his face covered in dust. Using the last of his strength, he raised his head to look at the young man on the horse's back. "The glory you brought back, cough cough." The muffled voice under the mask said, "I accept it." Brando looked down at the man and said, "Actually, I came to tell you that they did not blame you. That war was not your fault." Lord Krus froze. "How is that possible? Cough cough, you are not lying to me? You should know about the oak tree in Dakota's hometown. He asked me to let you take care of it." "His father planted it when he was young," Brando replied in a low voice. "It really is him." Sob sob sob. The knight cried like a child. "I am sorry." Brando did not say anything. The November War itself was a mistake. He knew that Lord Krus' story came from a quest in the game. Lord Krus was full of remorse for his mistakes. 10 years later, he would issue this quest to all the players he recognized. It was a quest that everyone in the South knew. The quest's name was Atonement. Brando admired the old knight because he was willing to repent for his actions. In fact, he did not make any big mistakes on the battlefield in Cantner. He only carried out his orders. Lord Krus wept and died. Brando sighed. The blood of Erwin's people flowed on the battlefield. He had no choice but to end the war. Perhaps only through the baptism of blood and fire could the kingdom be reborn. He raised his head and looked at the remaining Grauden knights on the battlefield. "Leave," he said. "This is no longer your battlefield." But the knights shook their heads. "We don't know what you know, sir, but you have brought glory to our Lord. This is a noble act." "Thank you," the leader of the knights replied. "But this is where we will die." The sound of swords being unsheathed could be heard. Brando shook his head and turned around. The black wolves swarmed forward. The Highlanders fled out of fear. Lord Krus died and Lord Krus's army fell apart. The Grey Bear Lord was hesitant and refused to step forward. Madara did not make a move. But it was fine. Dead people were not to be trusted. The situation on the battlefield seemed to have reversed in the blink of an eye. It was such a solid advantage, but it was gone in a moment. There was a sense of loneliness in the forest. Lord Paulus, who was at the front line, suddenly felt a deep sense of fatigue. He looked around and saw the determination in the eyes of the knights around him. But the corpses of the soldiers on the battlefield were piled on top of each other. Broken spears and broken armors were everywhere. The tattered flags were dyed with the color of the setting sun. In fact, they had already failed. But he could still retreat to Lord Paulus. These rebels could not hold him back. As long as he was still there, he could reorganize the army. Although Madara was indecisive, they were still a force to be reckoned with. But victory was so close, as if it was at hand. It was so close, but why did it disappear in the blink of an eye? Or was it an unrealistic hope? What's going on? Everything he was familiar with was already far away, leaving behind only the taste of the past memories. The older knights took the younger knights to battle. Before the battle, they told the young Erwin's belief. This belief was passed down from generation to generation. Lord Paulus was once young. He still remembered the songs of the knights. But those ballads were no longer sung. The decaying kingdom was like a dilapidated wall, blocking out all light. The old knight seemed to see the light of new life piercing through the dark wall. He wanted to see the hope behind the wall. But before that, he was destined to be crushed under the collapsing wall. After the news came from both sides of the battlefield, he lost control of the army. Most of the soldiers from the foreign territories fled. The lords and lords retreated to the back of the battlefield. Lord Paulus did not want to mock these cowards because it was meaningless. He led the 3,000 men of Lord Paulus's territory forward. The old knight's mask was stained with the blood of the setting sun. Now he was going to put an end to this war. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 490. Madara's proud and fearsome army did not dare to cross the line. This was because there were two people standing in front of the undead army, a man and a woman. The woman was an elf, proud and calm like the stars in the sky. She was young and did not seem to be able to show such a calm demeanor, but it did not affect her temperament as a commander. Medisha held a silver shuttle in her hand, holding her spear horizontally, and quietly stopped less than 100 steps away from Tarkus. In her eyes, Madara's army seemed to have disappeared. The man was a middle-aged swordsman. From beginning to end, he did not even look at Madara's army, but the tens of thousands of Madara's undead did not dare to ignore his existence. This was because he was Mephistopheles, the Grey Sword Saint. Lord Paulus has begun the charge. A black knight whispered in Tarkus's ear. Tarkus nodded. What did Lord Incersta say? Lord Paulus said Erwin has never lacked heroes. This is the choice of a soldier, and we must respect the glory of the battlefield. The Black Knight replied in a low voice. Tarkus nodded. The vampire commander looked at Medisha, then at Mephistopheles and replied, Then let's retreat. I hope we can set foot on this land again in our lifetime. We are already dead, Lord Paulus. The Black Knight replied in a low voice. Tarkus thought for a moment and nodded. The figures of the undead disappeared from the forest bit by bit. There were only 2,000 people left on the battlefield. Their enemies were only a few hundred mercenaries, tree elves and centaurs. But the result was already decided. 2,000 low-level iron soldiers and less than 100 silver-level knights. Their enemies were hundreds of silver-level knights, and even silver-level knights who had survived the calamity of wolves. The Pegasi soared into the sky, and the tree elves' longbows did not miss their targets. It was a one-sided massacre on the battlefield. Lord Paulus felt a sharp pain in his heart when he heard the screams of the young man beside him. These were once Erwin's future that he believed belonged to. Yes, generation after generation, Erwin, the older knight, led the younger knights to the battlefield, sang the knight's battle song, and brought them supreme glory. But the older knight found himself powerless. The assault had been stopped long ago. Just on this side of the battlefield alone, Lord Paulus saw at least 4 gold-rank combatants. A red-haired girl with a ponytail who used a spear, a tree elf, a centaur, and an unbelievably beautiful girl with short hair who was dressed in men's clothing. This was the so-called rebel army. At some point in time, the golden flags on the battlefield had been dyed with the color of blood. The old knight watched as the young faces disappeared from his sight. Suddenly he felt that it was time for this farce to end. Yes, it was time to end this. The spear in Scarlet's hand was no longer the original spear of lightning. The spear of lightning was lost in the dark forest and could not be found. What she was holding now was just an ordinary magic spear. Brando had promised her that he would help her find a suitable weapon after leaving the dark forest, but she did not want to trouble him with this matter. She was afraid that Brando would find her troublesome and despise her like Makarov did. But it was not a good idea to not have a weapon. She was now the strongest person in Brando's camp. Although she was still far from Mephisto's level, Mephisto was not actually one of Brando's men. At most he was an ally. As for Brando, although he was strong, he was only at the middle of gold rank. Scarlet, on the other hand, was at the peak of gold rank and was only one step away from stepping into the realm of elemental mastery. With her current strength, using an ordinary magic spear was already limiting her combat prowess. However, the girl was a little worried about her personal gains and losses. She gripped her spear tightly and pursed her lips as she slaughtered her way through Count Ranner's remaining troops. The remnants of Count Ranner's army were only Lord Paulus's own troops. The knight and gold-ranked swordsman reinforcements had already fled long ago. The remaining soldiers were not a threat to her at all. She and Mephistopheles weaved through the enemy's formation in an attempt to completely divide and defeat them. In fact, even Scarlet herself could feel that the enemy was at the end of their rope. At this moment, the spear in her hand trembled as she felt an obstruction in front of her. The girl was slightly startled. She raised her head, and a few people were reflected in her fiery eyes. To be more precise, it was a small group of knight. Lord Paulus's knight regiment. Scarlet's heart trembled. She knew that a silver-ranked knight was the backbone of an army. If she could destroy them first, then this war could end early. Thinking of this, she immediately rushed over there to kill. To her surprise, the other party's reaction was very fast, and he almost immediately noticed her intentions. 4 to 5 knight immediately surrounded her. Reckless. Scarlet furrowed her brows and thought to herself, these knights should be very clear of her strength. She was at the peak of gold rank and could not be compared to these silver-ranked knights. However, these knights did not hesitate when they charged towards her. She could only see determination in their eyes. They were all youths. Scarlet looked at the nervous faces of these youths and suddenly felt sorry for them. For a moment, she thought of her companions who had passed away. Her hand slowed down a little, and the murderous intent in her spear changed direction. Bang! 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 The knight was knocked down from his horse. She continued to move forward, and a knight completely covered in armor appeared in the crowd. Scarlet noticed that the knight was only a silver-ranked, but he was unbelievably experienced. He actually dodged her spear. She did not think too much about it and immediately chased after him with her spear. However, she did not expect the knight to parry her spear with his sword and slash at her at the same time. Scarlet was a little nervous. She subconsciously thought that the enemy was a gold rank who was hiding his strength. She immediately retracted her spear and no longer held back. She feinted with her spear to deceive the enemy's center of gravity. Then, she parried the enemy's sword with her spear and finally pierced the enemy's breastplate. The 3 consecutive spears did not have any room to stop. With a crisp sound, the spear instantly pierced through the enemy's breastplate and pierced through the enemy's body. High-grade magic armor? Scarlet immediately felt that something was wrong when she pierced through the enemy's breastplate. The magic armor he was wearing was not a normal knight's magic armor, but a higher-grade commander's armor. And in this army, there was only one person who could wear such a knight's armor. She was shocked, but she suddenly felt that her surroundings had quietened down. All the knight and soldiers of Count Ranner who were fighting seemed to have stopped at this moment. At first, it was only the people around her, but the throbbing quickly spread out like a ripple, and the entire battlefield miraculously came to a standstill. Lord Paulus. A young man who just got up from the ground immediately rushed to the knight who fell under Scarlet's spear. The old knight who was lying in a pool of blood coughed violently. However, his first action was to remove his mask. It was a face that belonged to an old man. His face was full of wrinkles, and his snow-white eyebrows seemed to contain the hardships of this kingdom. His dim, gray eyes seemed to have seen too many storms. He had seen the knights who sang loudly in battle, the older knights who led the younger knights to the battlefield of no return, the glory and triumph that belonged to Erewhon. He had also seen the defeat, the fall, and the final twilight of this kingdom. However, this kind of glory seemed to have fused into a pair of eyes that were flickering with the light of life that was fading away. It was as if everything of the past had returned. Lord Paulus smiled. He first waved his hand weakly at the knight beside him, then raised his head and asked Scarlet, "Little girl, where are you from? I don't believe that you are just ordinary rebels." Scarlet suddenly felt a little helpless. In theory, the old man in front of her was their greatest enemy in this battle, but at this moment, she found that she was unable to reject his question. "I'm from Erewhon," she replied. "Impossible. Peak gold ranked. Peak gold ranked. When did Erewhon have such a young genius? A true genius?" The old man shook his head weakly. "I'm really from Erewhon. I'm a Highlander from Ranner. I used to be a mercenary, and it was Lord Paulus who took me in." Scarlet said seriously. "Such stubbornness, the stubbornness of an Aween citizen. I'm starting to believe that you're an Aween citizen." The old man smiled, but his smile seemed to have used up the last of its splendor. "But why would a genius like you be willing to serve in the rebel army?" "No, there is no such thing as submission. Lord Paulus is better than me. But even so, he is very good to everyone. Compared to Grodin, I think he is the best lord." Scarlet replied seriously. "Is that so? What is your Lord Paulus called? Cough cough, name?" "His name is Brando." "Brando. Brando." Lord Paulus closed his eyes and suddenly let out a long sigh. He felt his limbs gradually turning cold, and he lost consciousness. Even his breathing became difficult. But the old man still had one last question. He looked at the battlefield and saw the blood flowing in the forest. It was Erewhon's blood. "What purpose do you have here?" "I don't know, but Lord Paulus said that he is here to save Erewhon." "Save Erewhon?" Lord Paulus's eyes lit up. He looked at Scarlet with a complicated gaze. "How do we save her?" Scarlet shook her head. "I don't know, but I believe that Lord Paulus can do it. Just like how no one believes that you nobles can do it." We nobles. Haha. Cough cough cough." The old knight suddenly laughed and shook his head with the last of his strength. "Well said. Listen to my orders, my knights. Surrender." His words were like rolling thunder, and all the young knight were stunned. "Impossible, Lord Paulus. If you die here, we will die here too. This is our honor." "No." The old man weakly closed his eyes. He spoke softly as if he was using the last of his strength. "You must surrender. This is for Erewhon's honor. For Erewhon's unparalleled honor. P.S. I promise you that the explosion is coming. Everyone, please support me with your votes and give me some motivation. I'm rolling on the ground looking for motivation. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 492. Count Ranner lost? The parchment in Oberway's hand slipped to the ground, and he had to grab it before he could regain his footing. He raised his head and revealed a look of surprise. Princess Graphine listened to the news without batting an eyelid. The outcome of the battle in the south was not announced immediately. Count Ranner's army was routed, and the people around him were speechless for a moment. The losses of the Allied army were not that great. Most of the soldiers fled with the frightened mountain people, and the army of the Grizzly Bear territory was unscathed. The real losses were only a few thousand noble soldiers under Lord Cruss and Lord Paulus. However, the deaths of Lord Paulus, Wade, and Lord Cruss caused the entire southern territory to whisper to each other. Countless nobles of various sizes died in the battle. 2 of them were feudal lords, and 1 of them was a trusted retainer of Count Ranner. The forces in Tonajul and the northern regions were emptied. Even if Count Ranner wanted to, he would not be able to form another army to attack Abes. Unless he personally led an army, but that was impossible. Which feudal lord did not have enemies? Count Ranner had to constantly be on guard against his enemies taking advantage of the situation to attack him. Especially at this time, everyone thought that he was a tiger that had lost its fangs, and even his internal organs were beginning to stir. Even though Count Ranner hated Brendel to the core, he had to solve his own problems first before he could spare a hand to deal with Brendel. When Count Ranner had the time to take action, Brando felt that he would not have to be afraid of him at all. His original goal could be said to be at least half achieved at this moment. At the end of the month of the winter zither, when the flowers bloomed in February and the earth began to thaw, Erwin was discussing the battle everywhere. Only Tonajul was quiet, and the other side that participated in the battle rarely talked about it. Abes had also paid a heavy price in the battle, especially the mercenaries who delayed Count Ranner's army. They lost more than half of their men. Some of the veterans who had experienced the November War did not bow down to that tragic war, but they were buried on the banks of the Gree River. Their graves were now in a pine forest, as quiet as a poem. However, the shadow of war was soon washed away by the green wheat sprouts in the fields after the snow and ice melted. After a winter, Wound regained its vitality and vigor. This made people realize in disbelief that they had won. They won just like that. I didn't even have the chance to enter the battlefield. Karglai sat on a bench with his hands behind his head as he watched Odom and the Aween's royal blacksmith Grandmaster Bosley circling around a pile of scrap metal. At least to him it was just scrap metal, and it was just a bunch of broken swords. The most direct harvest from this battle was the large number of armors and weapons abandoned by the nobles. These were the things that Abes lacked the most, and Bosley estimated that they would be able to equip an army of 3,000 to 4,000 men. There's still a bunch of junk in my dimension that I collected from the ruins in the Loop of Trade Winds, so I decided to pour them all out. The result was that Bosley's blacksmith shop almost exploded from the sheer amount of junk that he had collected from the ruins in the Loop of Trade Winds. Bosley flew into a rage and chased Karglais and Bosley out of the house. Karglais had taken over Scarlet's position as captain of the White Lion Legion's NCO training, and had been following Bosley around all day. But a moment later, the blacksmith ran out again and grabbed Brendel's hand with glowing eyes. "My lord, where did you get all these weapons from? You didn't rob an Empire's warehouse, did you?" Brando flung his hand away. "Do you think that the Empire's warehouses are public toilets that you can enter and leave as you please? Even if it's a public toilet, you still have to pay to enter. Isn't that because you're my lord? Everyone says that there's nothing you can't do. Look, everyone is calling you the miracle creator Brando," Bosley said with a smile. "But then again, what's a public toilet?" Brando furrowed his brows. Who gave him such a vulgar title? What, miracle creator Brando? He sounded like the main character in those third-rate night novels. He thought that he would at least have a title like Wolf Herder. Titles were very important to a person's reputation. For example, Wolf Baron Oberway or Cross Hand Buga. Most people would know that it was related to the person's personality and ability. If a normal person was called Dead Maggot or Rotten Toe, Brando would rather find a pillar and kill himself. But Karglai's eyes lit up when he heard the vulgar title. He couldn't help but grumble. "Damn it, if I knew that I would come out with my lord, I might have a title too." "What title?" "For example, my lord is called Miracle Creator Brando. Of course, I wouldn't dare to compare myself to my lord, so I'll be called Karglai's follower of Miracle Creator Brando." The young man thought for a while and said seriously. Brando staggered and almost fell to his knees. He immediately looked at the noble descendant of Erwin, the second son of Lord Maxen, with a look of disdain. He couldn't help but worry about the future of the kingdom. What kind of twisted aesthetic is this? For the sake of his future captain and the White Lion Legion, he decided to correct Karglai's aesthetic attitude. "It's just a small matter. There will be plenty of opportunities to fight in the future. I just hope that you won't complain when the time comes." "Really?" "Of course," Brando replied. "Our enemies aren't just our own people but also Madara. Madara didn't even use their regular army in this war. Do you know why? Madara didn't use their regular army. Bosley didn't experience the first war of the Black Roses in the dungeon, but Karglais had more or less heard about this war." The young man couldn't help but widen his eyes. Madara invaded Erwin because of the endless internal disputes and unequal distribution of benefits. The new emperor ascended the throne, and the court was in turmoil. In order to divert the internal conflicts, Madara expanded outwards. In fact, the real war was just a legal plunder. The only ones who acted were the nobles. Brando replied seriously. It's just that this expansion is the external manifestation of Madara's internal changes over the past 10 years. The Black Knight of Madara in Sursta received the support of the Targus family due to his talent and entered Erewhon to seek the capital to rise to the top. Before that, he was just a young man who had just inherited the territory. In this war, there are many young men like him in Madara. And Sursta isn't the only one. This was the first time Brando spoke frankly about Madara's threat to his subordinates. In fact, he knew that he wasn't exaggerating. Bosley and Kargleis both gasped. How strong is the real Madara? The main forces of Madara's regular army are the Black Knight, the Dark Crusader, the Vampires, and the High Necromancers. The Black Knight and the Dark Crusader are at the bottom of the hierarchy in Madara's regular army. Their strength is at least above the silver rank. Normally, I would call them Tier 3 soldiers, Brando replied. As for the high-ranking forces, there are the Bone Dragons, the Vengeful Banshees, and the Blood Throne Lords. If Erewhon had relied on the Temple Guards, the earliest White Lion Knights, and the Iron Horse Knights created by the late King Eric, they might have had a chance. But now, Brando left some things unsaid. In fact, Madara wasn't the strongest force in the world yet. Whether it was the Cruz Empire, Saint Tassol, or the craftsmen of Buga, they were all much stronger than this new Dark Empire. At the very least, Buga's gargoyles and gemstone dragons had once dominated the battlefield. Buga's sky is the sky of the world. Such domineering words could only be uttered by the artisan mages. It's a pity that the training methods of the Iron Horse Knight have long been lost. Grandmaster Bosley sighed. Even the training methods of the White Lion Infantry have been lost many years ago, and the strength of the White Lion Infantry is much weaker than before. Brando nodded. He naturally knew this. The White Lion Infantry was the army that followed the late King Eric to conquer the world. Now that they were reduced to the level of Count Randner's personal guards, it could be said that it was the will of heaven. Erewhon had gone against King Eric's path, and thus received such a punishment. The Temple Guards were the product of the alliance between the Silver Elves and Erewhon. Medisha was one of the products of this alliance, but the alliance was long gone. Erewhon's people even misinterpreted the Holy Covenant and caused Martha's wrath. However, the complicated relationship between Erewhon, the Silver Elves, and the Wind Elves allowed the kingdom to survive until today. It was only after Madara's invasion that the world saw Erewhon's weakness that the kingdom gradually declined. But that was all in the past. Brando patted their shoulders. Don't be afraid, we can take it slow. The kingdom is not without hope. The training methods of the White Lion Infantry were lost in the war between the House of Cypher and the House of Corvado**. It is said that the descendants of the House of Cypher divided the training methods into 3 parts and brought them to the tombs around Monstro. If we have the time, we can go look for it. Year of Summer, New Moon War. Grandmaster Bosley thought that Brando was comforting him, but he did not know that what Brando said was true. The descendants of the House of Cypher divided the training methods into 3 parts and gave them to the 3 princes and princesses. One of the parts was recovered, and the other part was found in the tombs of Monstro. As for the last part, its whereabouts were unknown. The complete set of White Lion Infantry was said to be a Class 4 unit, but 2 of them would be Class 3 at the very least. Brando could also think of a way to train the Iron Horse Knight. This was one of the advantages of transmigrating. Now that he had some free time, he had to start preparing for this. However, he first called Bosley back to reality and asked, Grandmaster, the armor of the Crimson Banner Cavalry is quite good. Can you think of a way to improve it? Improve it? Bosley was puzzled. Even though the armor's defense is high, it's not suitable for heavy infantry, especially since it only strengthens the defense of the arrows. It's a little against the ideals of the White Lion Infantry. No, I want you to help me modify it so that archers can wear it. Brando shook his head. Archers? Bosley's eyes widened. He had never heard of anyone being so extravagant that even archers had to wear magic armor. It wasn't that archers weren't precious, but their position was too low. Using magic armor on them was too wasteful. Isn't this too extravagant? Not at all. What if they're the ones wearing it? Brando had Bosley turn around and pointed at a few tall tree elf girls with bows on their backs. They were strolling through the streets of the human world and looking around curiously. Then, Bosley couldn't find the words to object this time. Everyone knew that elven archers were all godly archers. However, he couldn't imagine what an archer wearing magic armor would look like. In theory, an archer's goal was to be agile. Oh, to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Qidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 493. It wasn't difficult for Bosley, who had been working with Ironfelt for decades, to modify the armor into an archer's armor. Archers had to be flexible in their waist, upper arms and back, or their accuracy would be affected. Bosley removed a part of the armor and replaced it with flexible plates. The next day he produced a sample. Quinn put on his armor and stretched his upper body, revealing a satisfied expression. The tree elves were tall and muscular, but Bosley's armor fit them perfectly. It was just that the armor that was supposed to be worn by human cavalrymen was a little too small for the tree elves. It looked a little like the armor worn by the Romans. It's a little too heavy. There's no way to reduce the weight, Bosley said. No matter how much the armor was modified, the weight of the armor would always fall on the shoulders. However, if the archer's shoulders were too heavy, it would greatly affect their accuracy. Bosley turned to look at his lord, waiting for Brando's response. Brando placed his thumb and middle finger under his chin and looked at the armor with satisfaction. The armor was like a work of art. After Bosley modified the armor's plates, the plates floated up with Quinn's movements and sparkled under the light. Just give me a weight-reducing prefix. Grandmaster Bosley, can you make a few more samples? He turned to Bosley and asked. A prefix was a type of enchantment, and there were several types of weight-reducing prefixes. Freya's wind dance from the half-plate of the wind armor was the best. Not only would the wearer not feel the weight of the armor, he would even feel as if he was surrounded by a gentle breeze, increasing his agility. That's not a problem. Why do you need so many samples? You'll find out soon enough. In fact, Bosley hoped that he would never find out. He watched as Brando took the armor from Quinn's hands and burned it in his hands. The intense magical reaction turned into bright sparks that shot out in all directions. Crackle! 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 The armor melted and formed a huge hole in the armor. It looked like the scene after a candle melted. The metal melted into liquid and sank inwards. The liquid state then solidified again, leaving behind a hole the size of a fist. Brando shrugged. No matter how he looked at it, the armor in his hands was ruined. Alchemy was a job with a high degree of randomness, especially when he wanted to figure out an effective wind elemental magic formation. He could only use the finished product to fill in the gaps. In the next few days, the green flames in the furnace never went out, and the clanging sounds in the smithy never stopped. One set of modified armor after another turned into scrap metal in Brendel's hands. He began to use the cheap wind azurite as the magic core of the wind magic circle. This kind of gem was the most common main material in Vaunt that contained wind elemental magic. It was also the cheapest kind. Although it was called a gem, it was actually cheaper than most magic crystals. Even in the past, when inflation was at its peak, this kind of gem could only be sold for a few thousand tor. However, the results of his experiments were not ideal. The best result he got from the wind azurite was the clumsy prefix. The weight reduction never exceeded 5%, and there were all kinds of negative effects. Brando then tried using celestial stone, green olive, and azure crystal. Each material was more expensive than the last, and the weight reduction increased from 10% to 15%. On the morning of the 5th day, Brando and Bosley, who had dark circles under their eyes, finally came up with the lightweight prefix. Lightweight archer armor. Defense +4, arrow resistance +2, weight reduction 20%. However, it was still much heavier than expected. Quinn also said that only the best archers among the tree elves could wear it in battle without any hindrance, but most people could not reach that level. At this time, the rate of archer armor that was modified from the Crimson Banner cavalry's armor had already reached 10%. This result was obviously not what Brando wanted. His goal was to raise the strength of the tree elves' archers to at least rank 3. The strength of a unit was based on a few numbers: attack, defense, mobility, and special abilities. As for increasing attack power, Brando could only do so if he could create a tree elven longbow. That was the standard equipment for the tree elves' archers, but it was a product that was almost 50 years in the future. Moreover, he did not know anything about making bows, so he might as well think of a way to increase his defense. However, it seemed that it was not realistic to equip the tree elves with new armor. At the very least, there was a bottleneck when it came to weight. If this problem was not solved, it would be impossible to equip the tree elves with new armor. The solution was to increase the lightweight prefix to agile. That way, a 30% weight reduction would be enough to meet his requirements. However, the cost of modifying the armor had already exceeded 30,000 Tor coins. If it continued to increase, Brando believed that Amandina would come to him to hand in her resignation letter. There's no other way. Grandmaster Bosley was sprawled on his workbench, his hair messy like a bird's nest. This is the limit. If we don't increase the weight, it'll affect our defense. Grandmaster Bosley muttered weakly as he lay on his workbench. Let's equip the elites of the tree elves first, Tamar suggested. He was invited by Brando to participate in the plan. The future master alchemist had been helping Amandina and Seal design the mage tower that they had been planning for a long time. Amandina's magicite laboratory was also part of the plan. Magic was an important resource in Wone's world, and the importance of a wizard tower to a territory was self-evident. Moreover, the wizard tower could gather mana from the public mana pool. Not only could it greatly increase the strength of the spellcasters under him, it could also speed up the development of wizard apprentices. Even the lowest level alchemy laboratory could provide the alchemists working in it with an additional alchemy level bonus. An advanced alchemy laboratory was equivalent to directly providing the Lord with a number of professional alchemists. As long as there was a little bit of money, there was no lord who would not be willing to build a wizard tower in his territory. Moreover, a good mage tower could attract even more mages to become his subordinates and advisors, so why not? Originally, Brando did not want to delay Tamar's progress. But with his black hole of funds, Amandina had no choice but to ask Tamar to help. Otherwise, she was worried that Brando would use the entire territory's wealth to create a super army. In her opinion, her lord seemed to be such a militaristic person, as if he never had a sense of security and always prioritized the development of military power. But Brando still shook his head at Tamar's suggestion. He did not want a small group of elites. In fact, he did not lack such elites. He had the Planeswalker system and the Nest system. If possible, he could form an elite army by himself. What he needed was a main force. A main force like the centaurs, subterrane dwellers, and tree elves. And this main force had to be able to stand firm in the upcoming war. He thought for a moment and replied, "Continue to experiment, and see if you can use the same materials to create better enchantments. I'll think of other ways." Brando's method was simple. It was the dragon blood potion. Just like what Quinn said, the tree elves' final product was not completely useless, but it would more or less limit their combat strength. In other words, it was still a matter of weight. But for armor, other than reducing the weight, why not increase the weight of the tree elves? When it came to increasing strength, Brando could not think of anything else other than the dragon blood potion. However, the first batch of dragon blood potion was given to the future officers of the White Lion Legion. The second batch was given to the mercenaries, centaurs, and the tree elf archers to deal with the upcoming battle. There were only a few tree elves, only a few hundred of them. The tree elves in the forest could at least form an army of 1,000. Similarly, Brando did not only want to create rank 3 tree elves, but also the centaurs. This way, he would need thousands of bottles of dragon blood potion. This was not a small number. The blood from the multi-headed dragon would definitely not be enough, and Brando needed to find more materials. There wasn't enough time to acquire them, and Brando didn't want this to drag down his trip to Ampere Seal. He quickly thought of a way, and that was to breed the multi-headed dragon himself. And when it came to breeding the multi-headed dragon himself, it was natural to use a nest. But normal territories did not have enough space to accommodate a nest. For example, ABs did not have a natural place to gather mana. Brando naturally placed his plans on Valhalla. Speaking of which, ever since he left the Dark Forest, it seemed that it was time for him to rebuild this fortress that had borne countless glories. Brando simply threw the blacksmith's workshop to Bosley and Tamar, and buried himself in the research of the core magic circle of Valhalla. The core magic circle of Valhalla was not complicated, but it required a large number of magic crystals. If this was in the past, Brando would have gone crazy. But at this time, the first batch of people who went to the Black Forest had already returned. Under the protection of the mercenaries, the immigrants built a small mine in the forest. Although the first batch of magic crystals mined was not much, it was enough to satisfy Brando's initial needs. But although Brando was wholeheartedly focused on the magic circle, it was not to the point where he could not extricate himself from the outside world. He knew very well that at this time in history, Princess Grafine should be preparing to go to Ampere Seal to negotiate with Duke Erek. Since the month of spring's dawn in the Year of the Sword, Princess Grafine had already reached a certain degree of agreement with Duke Erek. He was actually a little hesitant about whether he should let the princess and Erek meet first. After all, with Erek in the north in front of them, Tanajil would not be the first to fall into the biggest whirlpool of the battle for the throne. But Brando quickly made up his mind. As the princess's supporter, he would not allow history to repeat itself. Since he had already made up his mind to put on a good show when the princess went to Ampere Seal, the stage this time was naturally the largest trading port in Erewhon. The time had been set, and everything he was doing now was actually to prepare for the upcoming trip. Brando did not put down the work at hand, but sent the Shire and his subordinates out to look for planeswalker cards. He was very clear that he could not bring an army to Ampere Seal, and even the Black Wolves could not follow. The only things he could rely on were the planeswalker system and his own strength. But after the battle in the Black Forest, the planeswalker system was now in a semi-crippled state. In order to revive the system, Brando knew that he first needed a new method of digging up graves. He planned all of this. Starting from the end of the month of the Winter Harp, the upgrading of the army, the rebuilding of Valhalla, and the search for planeswalker cards were all carried out in an orderly manner. To outsiders, Tanajil seemed unusually quiet, but inside slow and shocking changes were taking place. This silence lasted until the first week of the month of spring's dawn, when a piece of news was sent to Brando's desk. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 494. Looking down from the sky, the Tanajil region was high on both ends and low in the middle. There was a basin in the southwest, and Abi's castle was located in that direction. Looking east from Abi's castle, one could see the undulating shadows of the mountains under the azure sky. A large hilly region extended from the western foot of Mount Greyhar, where the tributaries of the Gree River converged. It was the best hunting ground in autumn and winter, and the densest forest was located there. This place was located at the border between Tanajil and Abis. To the north it was connected to Paulus, and to the east one could enter the Shaflund mines. It guarded the most important passage out of Tanajil, and it was the best location in Brando's vision for the Tanajil fortress. Although the terrain was uneven, it was never a problem for the dwarves. It was only because of the lack of funds that the plan had only just begun. Some troops were stationed in the hills, and only a few fortresses were erected on the main roads. In the central region of the hills, the forest was divided into an open space. This should have been a place of lush greenery, but now the open space was covered with rocks collected from the forest. On the uneven gray surface was a huge magic formation. Multiple concentric circles formed the main body of the magic formation, and many mysterious runes were written on it. Even the most famous masters in the Royal Society of Erewhon might not be able to recognize these ancient words. To Brando, this magic formation was at least from the era before the Darkness Dragon, and it could be traced back to the Twilight War. A mysterious power flowed in the magic formation, like the whispers of the forest. A pure natural power overflowed in the forest, and green vines grew at a speed visible to the naked eye from the cracks between the rocks. Although the magic formation had only been built for less than a week, the overgrowth of the vines made it seem like it had been sleeping in the forest for hundreds of years. The lush vegetation had been maintained for several days, and the magic formation seemed to be able to gather the magic in the forest. This was the completed Valhalla Central Magic Formation. There was a groove in the center of the magic formation, and it fit perfectly with the city core in Brando's hands. The magic array doesn't require an external source of mana. Once it's completed, it'll be able to extract free mana. Even us silver elves don't have such a powerful law. Medisha looked at the formation in the forest and praised. What a pure aura of nature, Sir Ruler, you are truly amazing. It's not my work, Brando replied, embarrassed. Behind Brando, the wild elf elder sister also agreed with the fairy princess. That's true, but no one can decipher the information about this magic circle on the crystal. Even the druid elders from the dark forest couldn't do anything about it. However, my lord has coincidentally read some ancient books about this. This is definitely a choice of fate. Brendel smiled when he heard Falern's words. He could decipher the crystal more or less because of his special identity. He could understand the real purpose of an item through the extra information projected on his retina, but the natives could only guess the function of a magic item through archaeology or general appraisal. Then Brando, when should we put the crystal in? The Roman sat on a rock and asked. It should be now, Brando replied. He had seen the process of cultivating a city core in the game. A city core was actually a semi-intelligent artificial life. It was planted underground like a tree, and then injected with mana to make it grow. However, before it was planted, it needed a magic circle to reinforce it. This was the first time Brando had seen it. He inserted the crystal in his hand into the groove in the center of the magic circle. He felt the crystal vibrate in his hand, and it seemed to emit a faint light. The light flowed along the runes of the magic circle like golden water. Brando quickly shook his head. At that moment he almost thought that his eyes were playing tricks on him, because a row of green text appeared on his retina. An unfamiliar request, connecting to the Lord system. Brando's Lord system was actually activated when he first became a Lord. The Lord system was a bit like the town panel in SLG. It could be used to monitor the operations of his territory. For example, Brando's Lord system currently had two submenus, the Loop of Trade Winds and Tanajul, 2/3 territories. He could see the income and expenditure of the two territories, their specialties, population, mines, forests, and security, etc. At the same time, there was also a set of personnel appointment data. For example, he could see who was in charge in different submenus. For example, the person in charge of Tanajul's finances was Roman. If Brando transferred Roman from this position, he could see a series of effects on the territory's finances in the future. This system already existed in the game, but it was more powerful in the game. Players could even use this system to make personnel appointments and issue government orders. However, in the world of Wone, the Lord system could not be used in real life. It was basically a surveillance system. Just the surveillance alone was already very powerful. Brando could see that if Roman was the person in charge of the Shaflund silver mine, then the income of the silver mine would increase by almost a third in the next 3 months. It was only when he discovered the secret of the Lord system that he had a direct understanding of this merchant lady's ability. But even so, he would rather let Roman remain in charge of Tanajul's finances. Although the little Roman's talent in financial management was far inferior to her talent in business, the trade in the territory was not only the income of the silver mine. Based on the total amount, it was better for her to stay in this position than to be the person in charge of the mine. Of course, these were all digressions. Brando looked at the line of green words floating in his vision. He was slightly stunned for a moment before he agreed to the request. Then, a new subsystem appeared under the Lord system. Its name was Valhalla. However, this system was still grayed out. Brando tried to touch it, but he immediately received a notification. Valhalla is being cultivated. The first stage requires 132,000 mana. 132,000 units of mana? Brando was shocked. The unit of mana here was mana. Of course, 130,000 mana was not something that anyone could provide. Even the leaders of the wizards like William and Tullman would be sucked dry if they came here. This amount of mana could only be provided by magic crystals. Brando immediately understood. The lowest grade of magic crystals was the Lesser Moonstone, followed by the flame-patterned agate. But he was not a wizard before, nor was he a professional alchemist. He did not know how many units of mana could be converted from a Lesser Moonstone. He was a little nervous. If the conversion rate was too low, then this thing called Valhalla would be a bottomless black hole. Thinking of this, Brando quickly took out the prepared magic crystal from the dimension cave. It was a lesser moonstone. The quality of the magic crystal veins in the dark forest was not bad. At least, the mana on this lesser moonstone was much richer than what Brando had seen in the market. He threw the lesser moonstone into the magic circle. Almost in the blink of an eye, the rhombus-shaped magic crystal lost its color and became transparent like glass. The notification in Brando's vision also changed. Valhalla is being cultivated. The first stage requires 131,900 mana. 1:100. Brando sighed in relief. If the lowest grade moonstone could be exchanged for 100 units of mana, then the highest grade of magic crystal would not be a problem. He then tried the flame-patterned agate. Sure enough, the exchange rate of a flame-patterned agate was about 2,000. In this way, 130,000 units of mana would only require a few hundred magic crystals. The magic crystals mined in the dark forest were in tons for the first time. In fact, the magic crystals in the territory were only needed by the mages in the Shire, Lubai, and Master Tamar. Therefore, Brando put almost half of the magic crystals into his own pocket. He was not worried that Valhalla would not need enough magic crystals, but he soon realized that he was too naive. Hundreds of crystals were thrown down in exchange for a pile of transparent and colorless glass. At this time, the city core had finally absorbed enough mana for the first stage. The entire crystal let out a creaking sound, and a large number of cracks immediately appeared on it. Then with a cracking sound, the city core shattered in front of everyone's eyes, and a tree grew out from the original groove. A small tree sprout. What the hell is this? Even with Brando's knowledge, he could not help but be dumbfounded. It was ridiculous enough to plant the city core like a tree, and he did not expect a sapling to grow out of it. But Brando also knew that this sapling was not ordinary. No one would believe that a few hundred magic crystals would produce an ordinary sapling. The sapling grew with the wind, and in an instant, it grew to about the same height as Brando. Brando looked up and saw that the sapling had begun to grow thicker and longer. It stretched out its branches like the ancient elves' sacred tree. In just a moment, it had grown to a height of several meters, and it needed a person to wrap their arms around it. In just a short minute, this sapling had grown to a height that ordinary trees would need at least 10 years to achieve. But it did not seem to have any intention of stopping. Everyone present saw dense aerial roots growing on the tree trunk, and many roots also sprouted from the surface of the stone formation. These roots were also growing at a speed visible to the naked eye, and then twisted together. In a few breaths, the sapling had grown bigger. They could only watch helplessly as an ancient tree grew. This is. At this time Orthlis, who had been sleeping in Brando's mind, was awakened by the drastic changes in the surrounding magic. She was speechless when she saw the tree. Brando was speechless for a long time, because right in front of him the sapling was getting thicker and thicker. Countless roots and branches extended from the trunk, and it had grown to a height that 7 or 8 people could wrap their arms around it. However, the height of the tree was not very high. It was only a few meters above the ground. At this time, Brando gradually saw the shape of the tree. It formed a natural square between the canopies. Holy shit! Brando finally reacted. Isn't this the world tree in the loop of trade winds? P.S. Put the Wind Archer Part 2 at the end. If you see it, don't ask where Part 2 went. Anyway, the chapters are in the right order. Yes, the development of this territory will be written together. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 495. The world tree stopped growing when it reached a radius of about 10 meters. The huge canopy stretched out in all directions and then stopped, as if it had been there for hundreds of years. The emerald green leaves covered the canopy layer by layer, forming a quiet hole with the surrounding forest. Rays of sunlight shone down from the branches and leaves like golden swords. Brendel looked up and saw the green veins on every leaf, as if a layer of jade-green blood vessels were distributed all over the tree crown. An ancient tree quietly sat in the center of the ancient and mysterious magic circle. The Roman was stunned, and Romaine's mouth was wide open in shock, as if she was letting out a short Scarlet's amber eyes widened behind her, but ever since she followed Brando, most of the things she encountered were strange, and this strong-willed ponytailed girl had more or less developed some self-control, so her eyes were only filled with disbelief. Medisha, who used to be the youngest silver elf princess, was slightly better. At least she still maintained the dignity of a silver elf, but her eyes flashed. Only the wild elf elder sister, Falerne, still had a poker face. This was not because of her personality, but because she was a part of the rules of a planeswalker. Unlike Medisha, who later became a knight, she had a lot more experience. After experiencing something even more unbelievable, even if a real-world tree were to grow in front of his eyes, it would not seem so surprising anymore. Brando, you just planted a seed? The first to speak was the Roman girl. Romaine's face was filled with curiosity and excitement. She probably thought that Brando had done something amazing again. How did a tree grow out of nowhere? It's growing so fast. Am I dreaming? Brando, pinch me. Brando glared at her and came back to his senses. Romaine's way of thinking could never be understood by a normal person. Just like when they first met Madara's undead in Butchie, she expressed her fear by saying, "Brando, will they eat us?" She also expressed her curiosity by saying, "Ah, that's amazing, Brando. This is the world tree, right?" Medisha turned around and asked. The fairy princess's silver eyes flashed with some kind of rationality, but she did not directly come to a conclusion. "My lord." "No, rather than saying that it's..." Brendel shook his head as he looked at the tree that could be considered huge. Instead of calling the tree the world tree, it would be more appropriate to call it a town under the cover of a huge tree. In some ways it was like the world tree in Valhalla. The same huge canopy, intertwined roots, and looked like a miniature version of the world tree. But this tree stretched out in all directions at the top, and even at the foot of the tree, one could see that it formed a huge platform. Rather than a platform, it was more like a square under the shade of the tree. The brown trunks formed a towering wall, protecting the square above the wall. There were even some slender branches that grew from the edge of the square, weaving together to form railings or handrails. But from a standard military point of view, this was a parapet or parapet. In short, the tree had grown into a small natural fortress. "This looks like a castle, so beautiful." Scarlet looked at the tree, or rather the small castle, in a daze. It was just like the castle in the forest described in fairy tales where the sleeping princess lived. It had a dreamlike verdant color. Even though the red-haired girl had long since tied her long hair behind her head like a true daughter of the mountain people and picked up a spear to throw herself into battle, she would still occasionally reminisce about the days when she longed for the fairy tales of the past. After all, compared to that, she would rather be a normal girl with the right to dream. Of course, if the Lord was willing to give her such a castle. Scarlet couldn't help but stare blankly for a moment. The Roman had already begun circling the tree, and it was obvious that she wanted to go up. After a while, the cute girl found a treasure. "There's a ladder here, Brando." There was indeed a ladder behind the ancient tree, like a spiral staircase to welcome guests, or rather, to welcome the master. The spiral staircase hung from the top of the tree. It grew naturally from the vines attached to the trunk, but it didn't look thick at all. Instead, it looked like it had been artificially woven, exquisite and beautiful. The width between each step was just right. The moment you saw this ladder, you would know that it wouldn't take much effort to climb it up. Moreover, it had a kind of intimate atmosphere, and no one would suspect that it was a trap. "Are we going up?" The merchant girl looked up, her beautiful bangs sliding to the sides, revealing her flat forehead. She blinked and asked Brando. Brando looked at the others. In the past, he had developed a habit in the game, which made him habitually ask for the opinions of the players in the same party, even though there was probably no other player here except for him. The quiet silver elf princess, the wild elf sister who would not disobey his orders even though she was very annoying. She was the secretary, or rather the head maid who was always by his side, and these were the roles that his subordinates recognized. There was also the little Roman and the mercenary girl who followed his orders. These girls were actually led by him. Brando quickly realized that he had made a habitual mistake. He couldn't help but shake his head with a smile. After all, habits in the game couldn't be changed in such a short time. The fairy princess saw the embarrassment of the Lord and smiled faintly. "We elves are very sensitive to the atmosphere of nature. This tree gives me a feeling of intimacy. But it's not a spontaneous feeling of intimacy. It's more like a feeling of home. As if it's inviting us up. Yes, actually I have the same feeling. Brando nodded, but his words were not entirely correct. For him, the relationship between the tree and him was more like a subordinate relationship. Because the city core that was planted was bound to him, he had a vague feeling that he could control everything in front of him. He even felt that he could command the spiral ladder. This feeling was so strong that Brando couldn't help but give an order in his mind. Shrink back. He ordered, and a soft rustling sound was heard. A miracle happened. The naturally hanging vine ladder actually retracted. It was as if the vines had suddenly come alive. They retracted and turned back into ordinary plants that clung to the tree trunk. Ah! The Roman was shocked and quickly hid behind Brando. You can command it? Medisha asked in surprise. Brando nodded. He was also very curious, but this curiosity had a certain guess. If this guess was true, then all of this would be a little too unbelievable. Let's go up and take a look. He immediately said. At this time, the curiosity of the others was more or less aroused. Even the expressionless Falerne couldn't help but carefully observe the vine ladder that was once again hanging down. The ladder was actually very sturdy. As expected, the group climbed up the spiral ladder without much effort. It was as if the ancient tree was holding them up. Soon, everyone reached the top of the trunk. What appeared in front of them was a small circular square. Under the lush shade of the tree, the square was about 100 steps from one end to the other. It was wider than expected. Surprisingly, the ground of the square was covered with a layer of stone instead of wood. A small fountain stood in the middle of the square, and the bottom of the fountain was full of shining pebbles. On one side of the square there was a large hall. The architectural style of the building was similar to that of the elves' houses. The pure wooden structure was built with arched beams and a tall roof that was full of fantasy. Everyone was stunned. This is the city hall. Medisha recognized this building. For the first time her eyes showed disbelief. Could it be that this tree is actually a magic town? I'm afraid you guessed right. Brando felt as if he had been hit by a huge surprise. Because of this, he was only suspicious at first, but when he saw this hall, he was sure without a doubt. Valhalla was a tree, a living city. A city could grow naturally and didn't need to be expanded. Its branches and leaves could shelter the entire territory from the wind and rain, and the city was a whole, so it was much easier to defend. Too cool. This was definitely the territory that Brando dreamed of. Although Valhalla was still very small, and the distance from one end to the other was only 30 meters, but even so, it already had the embryonic form of a magic town. In the city hall, Brando saw the full map of Valhalla. The map was presented on a wooden platform in the middle of the hall. Or rather, it was a natural tree stump. A crystal grew out of the tree stump, and the entire structure of Valhalla was projected in this crystal. It was hollow, and there were stairs from the four sides of the square that led down to the hollow branches of the ancient tree. The bottom was divided into many large and small rooms, which seemed to be the residential area and the natural warehouse of the town's residents. Brando found that this area could be transformed into a military camp, or perhaps it was the original intention of its existence. There was also a passageway in the town hall that led downwards. This passageway was connected to the 3 rooms at the bottom of the tree trunk. These 3 rooms had natural mana pools. These mana pools were connected to the ground by the massive roots of the ancient tree, so they could produce an endless supply of mana. These rooms were called the Magic Nest, and this was where the nest was located. At the same time, it could also be transformed into a crystal pool, or an alchemy laboratory, wizard tower. There are actually 3 mana pools. Medisha looked at the holographic map and was shocked. Such a small magic town, no matter how you look at it, it can only be considered a beginner territory? Beginner territory? What's that? The other girls looked at the fairy princess in confusion. P.S. A few days ago, the network in this area was under maintenance, so there were no updates. The nearby internet cafes also can't be accessed, so there was no notification on QQ. It seems like it's missing 3 to 4 chapters, and with the benefits it's a total of 5 chapters. Of course, it's not realistic to finish it in one day, so let's just update it for a few days. Also, I apologize for the lack of updates a few days ago. It was really unavoidable. Meow, I was leading the team that day and I dropped it. It was too embarrassing. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 496. I'm sorry for my rudeness. The silver elf took a deep breath to calm herself down and explained. Before the War of the Holy Saints, a concept used to differentiate the strength of a territory. Half of what we call a primary territory refers to a primitive area like Tanajul that has yet to be developed by magic. The girl gently pressed her hand on her chest. In such an area, the scattered mana is in a state of chaos. Only within a certain range, the mana will naturally converge into a mana convergence point, which is the mana pool, or the magic nest. She glanced at the others, mainly Roman and Scarlet. Actually, all of you have seen such a place before. A place where mana converges will be affected by chaos and become a monster's nest. So that's how a monster's nest is formed. Roman tapped his lips with his index finger and asked curiously. But how is a monster's nest related to the strength of a territory? Don't tell me that the more nests there are, the better? Isn't that strange? Medisha shook her head and couldn't help but laugh. Of course not, but in the civilized world, the human and elven armies will often seize such places and build monsters' nests to serve their civilization, or build wizards' towers and crystal ponds. Wizards' towers, crystal ponds, and monsters' nests can greatly enhance a lord's strength. Therefore, the more mana pools a territory has, the more mature and powerful the territory will be. Only a territory with at least 10 mana pools is qualified to be called a magic territory. The concept of a magic territory is far beyond the human's definition of a lord. In the entire multiverse, the lord of a magic territory is respected. Medisha said with a smile. A noble like Grodin is still within the scope of your human concept. But if he leaves your society or even if he leaves Erewhon, he is worthless. But even if he only has one mana pool, it means that he is at least famous in the world. She looked at Brando. Even though this young lord's name was not well known in Erewhon, but in the world that worshipped power, his status far exceeded Grodin's. In that case, how big is the area where there is a natural mana gathering point? Romaine asked again. She was always curious about such strange knowledge. About. Medisha thought for a moment. According to Erewhon's system, such an area is about the size of a baron's territory. Scarlet listened intently. She had never come into contact with such advanced knowledge before. In the borders of the kingdoms like Ranner and Grimoires, not to mention mercenaries, even nobles might not have heard of such things. She could not help but blurt out. Does that mean there's such a place in Ferber as well? Ah, so that's how it is. The Roman's eyes suddenly flashed with understanding. Romaine's reaction to such trivial matters was usually astounding. The Shire has been acting mysteriously recently. I heard from the mercenaries that he often appeared around Shaflund, saying that he wanted to build some sort of tower. So he was looking for a mana convergence point, right? That little brain of yours is pretty quick. Brando finally could not hold back his annoyance and interjected. I've always been very smart. Brando, you're too stupid to only realize it now, ouch. Romaine immediately hugged her head. Before Medisha's tail could fully curl up, Brando knocked her head. He did not know why this little girl who claimed to be a lady and elegant merchant would always use her only intelligence on such messy matters. Indeed, Tamar and Amandina calculated that there should be a mana convergence point near Shaflund. Brando replied. I didn't expect Miss Amandina to have the talent of an astrologer. Medisha praised sincerely. Brando also did not expect it, but Amandina had already calculated it before they entered the dark forest. At that time, they did not even have enough magic crystals to forge the White Lion armor, let alone build a wizard tower. But is a wizard tower like those spiky towers in the stories? What's the use of it? Is it the home of a wizard? Brando, is it where the Shire lives? The Roman held her head and asked evasively. Most people would not be able to answer this question. Even Medisha might not understand the mysterious things between wizards. But there was a wild elf sister, Falerne, who was an elementalist. Falerne bowed slightly and spoke in a methodical manner as if she was reciting a book. A wizard tower is not only a wizard's home, Miss Roman. At the top of the wizard tower, there is a huge resonant crystal. This crystal is carved out of magic crystal, and can increase the power and distance of most area of effect spells. It can even extend the range to thousands of meters, or even tens of thousands of meters. Wizards can use this crystal to form an indestructible fortification of the wizard tower, attacking the enemy from outside the line of sight. In addition, the crystal ball in the tower can also be used to monitor the territory. A wizard tower of the lowest level is enough to monitor the entire area around Abyss. It is one of the most important defensive structures in the territory. At the same time, there is also an alchemy laboratory and a public mana pool. A public mana pool. Training an apprentice wizard requires a lot of spellcasting practice. When a wizard is at a lower level, they often need to rest for a long time to recover their spirit after casting a few spells. A public mana pool can greatly reduce the time needed to rest. In other words, it shortens the time needed to train an apprentice wizard, Miss Roman. You don't have to call me that, Miss Falerne. It sounds scary. Roman patted her chest and said with some lingering fear. Anyway, I understand. A wizard tower is a very important place, right? Falerne nodded seriously. Brando also nodded. Falerne was right. In the game, it would only take 3 weeks to train a farmer into a soldier, but it would take almost a year to train an apprentice wizard. With the Sorcerer Tower, this time could be shortened by 10 times. Every month, the Sorcerer Tower could train a qualified sorcerer apprentice. After an apprentice wizard leveled up, they could become a grade 1 elementalist or wizard. At the same time, they could cast up to 3 Circle 1 spells. Among the Circle 1 spells, Magic Arrow and Magic Shield were the most practical spells. When cast in a group, they could still be very powerful. Moreover, apprentice wizards were the foundation of many types of troops. For example, anti-magic swordsmen and shadow cavalry needed to be trained as an apprentice wizard. The construction of a wizard tower required a mana pool, so a mana pool was very important to a high-level territory. Not only a wizard tower, but there were also artificial mana pools that could be converted into mana crystals, as well as lairs that could cultivate fantasy creatures. When a territory was enchanted to a certain extent, it could be built into a high-level camp. For example, the Pegasus Night Camp of the Tree Elves required a Pegasus lair and a moon gate. The Silver Elf girl continued. That's why, generally speaking, half of nature's primary territories would only have one natural mana pool like this, and Valhalla actually has 3 in her right hand. This is too inconceivable. It's like the legendary Magic Plains. Magic Plains? Brando turned to look at Medisha. He had heard of this term before. A magic territory in a civilized world can only be called a magic territory if it has at least 10 mana pools. However, there are some natural wastelands that have such power. Although there may not be 10 mana pools, we still recognize such a land as a natural magic territory. Medisha continued. The Magic Plains is one of them. I've heard of the Magic Plains as well. The Magic Plains are also known as the 4-leaf clover field. This kind of land has a high concentration of mana, and the growth of magical plants in the 4-leaf clover field is several times faster than normal guarded lands. Brando said. Martha's guarded lands are actually a type of magic ground, but it's a special kind. The Black Forest is also one, and there's also the Fire Plains and the Holy Land of War. However, I've only heard of them. She raised her head and said, but the world tree that my liege has planted has more magic power than any land with natural magic that I have ever seen. 3 mana pools, even the Silver Valley where we Silver Elves used to live doesn't have such powerful natural magic power. The legendary fortresses are said to be holy lands. They are the last bastions that our ancestors used to defend against the Twilight Dragon. They have the same power as the holy lands. The Silver Valley is also such a fortress. She continued. But they are far less powerful than the remaining power of Valhalla. I don't know why this fortress is so special, but it must have its reason for existence. If I have to give a name to the magic ground where Valhalla is located, I'll call it the Holy Land. Medisha said. Holy Land. That's a good name. The Roman agreed. Scarlet also nodded. She felt that the Lord's things should be worthy of such a name. Of course, if Brando knew of her thoughts, he would probably blush. The Silver Fairy Princess looked at the young man who was her master. Halrangaya. The Golden Apple, Valhalla. Legendary things appeared one after another around him. If it was before, she would have thought that it was a coincidence. But suddenly, Medisha wondered if this was a call from fate, just like how fate had called her back then. For some reason, she suddenly looked forward to the future. However, no matter what, the fact that Valhalla had 3 mana pools was like a pie in the sky. Normal players would often face a difficult choice when building a territory. There were 3 essential magic buildings for a beginner territory: the Wizard Tower, the Crystal Pool, and the Magic Workshop. However, Brando didn't have this concern. Tanajul already had a mana gathering point that could generate a mana pool. He could arrange the rest himself. Originally, he wanted to leave Valhalla's mana pool for the Hydra's nest, but now it seemed that there was still a surplus. But then Brando made a new discovery. He originally planned to transform the mana pool at the bottom into a Hydra's nest, but he then found that the mana pool at the bottom was not empty. Instead, it generated a building called the Vortex of Light. After looking at the detailed information on the holographic map, he found that this thing turned out to be a creature's nest. This nest could generate a creature called a light spirit. This thing sounded like a heroic spirit but also like a light elemental creature. It was definitely a pleasant surprise that there was a natural nest in his territory. Nests were not common goods in the entire history of the Amber Sword. Of course, nests like black wolves and wyverns were exceptions. However, Brando believed that Valhalla's nest would definitely not be of such quality. Moreover, most of the creatures in Valhalla's nest were very powerful. He was eager to know what this light spirit was. He suggested that they go down to take a look, and the ladies naturally did not object. Only Falerne stayed behind. Her reason was that Brando was cultivating the core of Valhalla here, and the messengers outside could bring news of Abies at any time. When the mercenaries saw a tree appear out of thin air, they would probably be scared half to death. She stayed outside to avoid unnecessary trouble. Brando could only praise this wild elf sister for her meticulousness. Out of all his subordinates, only Falerne and Amandina could be so meticulous. However, Amandina had been busy with the affairs of the territory recently, and only this wild elf sister with a poker face could help him deal with these trivial matters. Even though she always looked unwilling, the standard of her work was always top-notch. The rest of the people found the entrance to the hollow area below Valhalla at the back of the hall, and entered the room where the light vortex was. The lower area of Valhalla was actually like a huge tree hole. The floor and walls were made of pure wood. Even though it was smooth as if it had been polished by humans, the ceiling and walls had roots and vines that hung down, giving it a natural atmosphere. In the middle of a large crystal cluster that emitted a blue light, 2 large vines intertwined to form an arch. In the center of the arch, there was a golden vortex that was about 3 meters tall that was slowly stirring. The eye of the vortex seemed to be a passage that connected 2 worlds, and a ray of golden light shot out from it like a bridge that hung in the air. There were some plants growing in the corner of the room, and under the illumination of various lights, these strange plants reflected a myriad of colors that made it seem like an illusion. "It's so beautiful, Brando," the Roman couldn't help but praise as soon as he entered the lair. "This looks like a portal. This lair should be a passageway, right?" Medisha asked. Brando nodded. "To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 497. This was a portal-type lair, and it seemed to be connected to a secondary plane. This type of lair mostly produced creatures through summoning, using equivalent exchange to summon creatures to serve the summoner. Brando looked at the portal of light, and took out 2 secondary moon crystals from the dimension hole, and threw them in. Sure enough, the time vortex lit up, and a small head poked out from it. It was like a 3-inch tall little person, or rather, a scaled-down young girl. She had long curly hair and was covered in clothes as thin as a cicada's wings. Her entire body glowed, and although she had no wings, she could agilely hover in the air. She looked outside from the vortex, then flew to Brando and the others and said respectfully, "Hello, my lord." Her voice was thin, and her accent was a little strange, as if she was a foreigner speaking Cruz. As the girl spoke, she looked at everyone curiously, but she was not afraid. "The lord she's talking about is the master of a magic territory, similar to your human lord, but different. In the eyes of magic creatures, only those who have power are natural lords, and they don't agree with titles." Medisha explained to Scarlet and Roman. "Oh." Roman nodded, but it was not clear if he understood. Brando nodded. Unlike Scarlet and the others, he was no stranger to magic creatures because of his experience in the game, so he asked directly, "What's your name? What kind of creature are you? And what abilities do you have?" "My name is Monica." The girl put her hand on her chest and introduced herself. "We are light spirits, the people of light entrusted to protect this sacred land. Our ability is to nurture this World Tree Fortress." World Tree Fortress? Brando frowned. For some reason, he was very familiar with this name, as if he had heard it somewhere before. But thinking about it carefully, he did not know if this memory came from the game or the myths and legends of this world. The World Tree Fortress, or in your words, Lord, you can call it Valhalla. However, Valhalla is actually the name of the second World Tree Fortress. This is the third and last one. Monica replied. What second and third? What exactly is a World Tree Fortress? Brando could not help but ask. I don't know about that, my lord. Our knowledge comes from the inheritance of magic. That's what my memories say. This tree is the most basic form of the World Tree Fortress. That's all I know. Brando nodded again. What Monica said was not strange. Many of the knowledge passed down in the bloodline were just words and phrases. However, this was only a casual question. He was more concerned about Valhalla's growth potential. Your ability is to nurture this tree. How do you do that? The world tree grows slowly once it sprouts. Think of us as gardeners pruning the branches of the tree, my lord, Monique replied. Brando understood. So, you are the workers of this town, right? Monica nodded. You can put it that way. We can help you build this city according to your wishes, Sir Overlord. Then what can you build now? I can't do it alone, my lord. The light spirits are not omnipotent. I need more of my people to work with me. If there is 1, 2, or 3 light spirits, I can help my lord build the tree nest. Tree nest? Brando did not understand. He was very familiar with the order of construction in the kingdom of Erewhon, such as the nobles' barracks and blacksmiths. He had also seen some high-end buildings, but he had never heard of such a term. What is that? The tree nest can cultivate the ancient tree roots. They are the most basic defense of the world tree. Their strength is about the pinnacle of silver tier, but they cannot leave the world tree. My lord, you can see them as mobile fortifications, or the guards of this town. In addition, the Ents and the world tree are actually one. They are a part of the world tree, so they do not need the mana pool to provide them with power. The tree nest can be built in this square, or on the top of the tree crown. It does not need the mana pool, Monica added. A part of the world tree? Brando felt that this sounded like the rotten beasts of the golden demonic tree, but he was still very interested in the tree nest that did not need the mana pool. Although they could not leave the world tree, they could be used for defense. After all, they were guards at the peak of silver. How many of these guards can the tree house create? With the current space of the world tree, it can at most accommodate 1, 2, 3 for tree nests, and each tree nest can produce 1, 2, 3, 10 roots, my lord. Monica calculated seriously. 40, that was not enough. He was a little disappointed. If there were 100 of them, he could rely on Valhalla without any worries. But when he thought about it, Valhalla was only the size of a palm, and the city hall was already a little cramped. Even if there were 100 or 1,000 guards, there would not be enough space to fit them. Thinking of this, he asked again, Valhalla, I mean this world tree, how can it continue to grow? Monica replied, that's the mission of the light spirits. Our mission is to nurture the growth of the world tree. However, if it's just Monica alone, it will take 1, 2, 3. Wait, don't count. Just tell me how many years it will take. When Brando heard Monica counting to 40 with her fingers, he finally could not help but sweat. He was afraid that this little girl would keep counting until the sky turned dark. How do you know how many years it will take if you don't count? Monica stared at Brando with her eyes wide open, seriously wondering if her lord was an idiot to ask such a stupid question. Brando immediately knelt down. The two of them haggled for a long time, and finally understood that if she were to cultivate the world tree alone, it would take 200 years. 200 years! Scarlet was shocked when she heard this number. As a standard mortal, 200 years was a little hard for her to accept. That was almost the time of a mortal's life. That is to say, as long as you have 200 people, Monica, you can shorten the time to 1 year, right? Brando had his own set of calculations. After all, 400 moon crystals was not an unacceptable price for him. Let me calculate. Don't calculate yet, just tell me yes or no. Brando was sweating profusely again. In the previous discussion, he had discovered that the light spirits did not only count to 10, but they seemed to like to do things by the book and did not like to save steps. All right then, but if we have to complete it within a year, we won't be able to spare time to help Lord Brendel build other buildings. Monica thought for a moment and answered. However, this was not a problem for Brando. He could pay more light spirits to help him build his territory. But just as this idea formed, Monica saw through it and immediately shattered Brando's fantasy. My lord, there is a limit to the number of light spirits that can pass through the portal. Are you thinking of summoning thousands of light spirits to help Monica? Limit. Brando's daydream was shattered like a mirror falling to the ground. He never thought that there was such a setting. What is the limit? The light vortex can only withstand 20 energy transitions per month. That's 20? Monica nodded. 20 a month. Just summoning 200 light spirits would take 10 months, which meant that it would take at least a year and a half for the world tree to grow to the next stage. Brando suddenly felt a little disillusioned. He did not have that much time. He thought that Valhalla Fortress would become his main force in a short period of time. But fortunately, Monica's next words gave him a glimmer of hope. She said that the portal could be expanded, but the prerequisite was to build a moon tower in Valhalla. Brando knew about the moon tower. It was a type of auxiliary building to the mage tower, and its function was to train astrologers. In the game, astrologers were actually a type of wizard. Their ability was prophecy, and at the same time they were proficient in channeling mana. Astrologers could change the location of mana gathering points, or use the moon tower to channel mana from the mana pool into the lair, increasing the production of creatures in the lair, or increasing the efficiency of the alchemy laboratory. This was their function in the game, and Monica wanted to use the first function of the moon tower. Even though he did not know if the stats in the game would work here, but since a native like Monica said that it would work and Medisa did not object, then there should be no problem. A moon tower could strengthen 3 other buildings. Although the moon tower itself required a location for a mana pool, its effect was equivalent to dividing the mana pool into 3. In the past, it was not a rare building in the game. However, Brando felt that he would be the first to build a moon tower in a beginner's territory. Normally, Lord-class players would either build a wizard tower or a crystal pool. Very few would even build lairs, let alone a moon tower. Although Brando had never been a Lord-class player, he felt that it was too strange. However, with the moon tower, the production of the light vortex could be increased to 40. Brando was very optimistic about the growth of Valhalla. After all, the title of the most legendary territory in the Amber Sword was not given by him. He saw Valhalla as his biggest potential support in the future. As long as this fortress could be revived faster, it did not matter how much he invested. And so, Brando used the remaining secondary moon crystals to summon the remaining 19 light spirits. He did not know what kind of bad taste the designer had, but the light spirit race did not seem to have any males. All the light spirits that were summoned were all small and soft girls. They were like real fairies chattering non-stop. In a short while, the Hall of Yggdrasil was as lively as Erewhon's most prosperous market. Brando and the others could not help but feel a headache when they saw the noisy light orbs flying all over the sky. He could imagine how lively the city of trees would be when there were thousands or even tens of thousands of such residents in the future. In fact, he doubted that the other residents of the city would be able to sleep at night. At the same time, he also asked Monica about the other abilities of the light spirits. He learned that it would take about a week for the 20 sisters to build a moon tower. This was not considered slow. The construction of a moon tower required the magical power of a wizard. If Brando only relied on the help of the Shire, his apprentices and half-baked warlocks, it would take at least 2 to 3 months. This was also the estimated construction time of his wizard tower. At the same time, apart from the tree burrow, the light spirits would also build 2 special buildings that belonged to Valhalla: the Valuran Warrior Hall and the Wind Archers Camp. Brando had never heard of these 2 buildings before, but according to Monica, these 2 buildings were the core of Valhalla's ability to preserve Valhalla's heroic spirits. Thus, Brando guessed that these 2 buildings would be used to train these 2 special units. Since Monica said that these 2 buildings did not require a mana pool, he would definitely put them on the agenda. After all, this was the main reason why he needed Valhalla. The Valyrian Warrior Hall would take 10 light spirits a month to build, and the Wind Archers camp would take less time, but it would still take 3 weeks. Brando planned to build the Warrior Hall in the plaza, directly opposite the City Hall, while the Wind Archers would be able to use the 2nd floor of Valhalla. The tree burrow would be built on top of the canopy, and it would take up all the space available in Valhalla. Just as he finished his calculations, he raised his head and saw Falerne walking in with a few people. Behind her was Lord Maxon's second son, Carglaise, who was the captain of Maxon's personal guard, and 2 other tall tree elf girls with longbows on their backs. Carglaise walked around the Hall of the World Tree, looking around curiously like a monkey. He did not look like a noble at all. However, the 2 elven girls weren't much different. They looked at the tree hall with astonishment. The tree elves had never seen such an architectural style outside of the Green Tower, which was similar to their hometown. However, when Brando saw Carglaise and the tree elves together, the first thing that came to his mind was whether Bosley and Tamar had made any progress. Author's note: didn't we agree on 2 chapters, but each chapter is 4,000 words? Oh my god. Why don't we release 2 chapters this month? Or maybe we can vote on it. The options are A1 chapter, B1 chapter, C1 chapter, D1 chapter. Author's note: to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 498. Carglaise brought good news for Bosley and Tamar. To be exact, he brought back a new set of archers' armor. The archers' armor was modified from the Crimson Banner Cavalry's armor. The surface had been polished and engraved with patterns, making it look completely different from the half-finished archer's armor. Carglaise placed the new set of archer's armor on the table. The new set of archer's armor was dark green in color, and the light patterns on it were said to be based on the aesthetic style of the tree elves. The archer's armor shone brightly under the sunlight that penetrated through the stained glass ceiling of the hall. It looked like a piece of jade art, but compared to the original, Brando noticed that the new archer's armor had an additional long feather cloak. The cloak was not only added for aesthetic reasons, but also to reduce the overall weight of the archer's armor without increasing the cost. Erwin's master forger and the future master alchemist had thought of many ways to reduce the weight of the archer's armor. In the end, they came up with a clever idea, and that was to add an additional magic cloak to the archer's armor. This cloak was actually enchanted with a spell similar to Wind Feather. Wind Feather was a level 1 spell of the wind element. It could slightly increase the speed of the target and allow the target to float. Carglaise even brought 2 female tree elves to demonstrate, and the results were excellent. Although the 2 tree elves were unavoidably clumsy after putting on the magic armor, it was definitely worth it compared to the increase in defense it brought. Moreover, after activating the magic cloak, it was as if wings had sprouted from their backs, and they could leap up and down from wall to wall. Brando thought that the design of the cloak was a stroke of genius, especially when the 2 tree elves put on the new emerald armor and pulled up the hood of their cloaks, revealing their pointed chins. They held longbows in their hands, and the edges of their cloaks drooped down to the ground. His eyes almost popped out of their sockets. It was said that the Silver Elves had a legendary army called Linji's Blade, and they were also dressed in the same way. The Linji's Blade had silver robes and silver bows, and the Tree Elves' archers did not pale in comparison. Medisha seemed to be in a daze. She looked at the 2 tree elves in front of her and suddenly asked, "My lord, can I lead this army?" Brando did not expect Medisha, who had always been aloof from worldly affairs, to take the initiative to ask, "Medisha? They're elves?" I know. Medisha, she lowered her head and said, "I'm sorry, my lord." Brendel looked at him and suddenly remembered something. "You used to be the commander of Linji's Blade?" Medisha's Medisha. And Medisha. Amazing Medisa. Brendel praised. The Linji's Blade was the strongest army in the Silver Elven Empire. It had been the strongest archer army in Wone for centuries. Medisha being their commander was something to be proud of, but this Silver Elf girl had never mentioned it. Brando did not even know that she knew archery. Thank you. Medicia's face turned red as she replied in a small voice. You're a silver elf? You've experienced the War of the Holy Saints. The tree elf girl's eyes lit up in disbelief. She immediately looked at Brando. My lord, she's the commander of the Silver Elves? Can you let her teach us? Brando was stunned. He was still thinking that Medicia, the Silver Fairy Princess, had hidden her abilities well. He did not expect the tree elves to give him another surprise. This was because the commander of the tree elves also held the position of archery instructor. If the tree elves wanted Medicia to teach them, it meant that they wanted Medicia to lead them. In theory, the tree elves were his allies. Even if he wanted to appoint a commander, he would need their permission first. But this was too much of an initiative. Brando felt a little awkward. Of course. But what about Mr. Quinn? The tree elf leader, Quinn, had returned to the Green Tower after the war ended. However, all the tree elves and druids he brought with him remained in his territory. Brando had full authority over the tree elves, but Quinn was still the commander of this army. Mr. Quinn, it's fine. The tree elf girl shook her head and smiled. Mr. Quinn has already passed his position to me. I can make the decisions. You are? Brando looked at her curiously. The tree elf girl smiled. She already knew this young human lord, but Brando didn't. She extended her hand and smiled. Finny, I'm the leader of the archers. Nice to meet you, my lord. Her human etiquette startled Brando. He had never seen such an extroverted tree elf. In his mind, the tree elves were a simple and cautious race. However, Brando still extended his hand and shook Finny's hand. If that's the case. He hesitated for a moment before replying. Then I'll entrust Medicia to you. She's my best subordinate. I hope you can work well together. Of course. I never dreamed that a hero who experienced the War of the Holy Saints would lead us. Finny said happily. Hero. Brando looked at Medicia in confusion. Although this silver fairy princess was outstanding in all aspects, whether it was etiquette or the way she treated others, he still found it hard to associate her with the word hero. No matter how he looked at it, Medicia was still like a human girl who hadn't grown up yet. No matter how calm and mature she was still like a little sister in his eyes. The silver elf girl smiled faintly at him. Lady Medicia, may I ask how old you are now? Did you experience the War of the Lilies? Finny asked curiously. Medicia looked at Brando. I'm actually in a spiritual state. Before the War of the Lilies, I had already returned to my ancient homeland in hibernation. If it wasn't for my lord, I would still be under the influence of the dark forces. But Sir Lord woke me up, just like the call of fate. I'm sorry, I didn't know you were already. Finny didn't expect Medicia to have died long ago. She looked at her with sympathy. You must be a heroic spirit now, right? I heard that heroic spirits will assist wise kings. The archer captain couldn't help but look at Brando. Ahem, it's not that ridiculous. Brando immediately coughed loudly. That's just a legend. He had always believed that he transmigrated to this world to make up for his regrets. His greatest hope now was to help the future Princess Griffine revive Erewhon. As for Finny's unintentional words, he didn't even think about it. The throne was an unimaginable temptation to the greedy nobles of Erewhon, but it was nothing more than a burden to him. But back to the topic at hand, he was very satisfied with the archer armor that Bosley and Tamar had created. As expected of future grandmasters, this improved magic armor was impeccable in every aspect. Winged archer armor defense. 4. 5 arrow resistance +2 weight reduction 20% wings of wind. Recharge in 10 minutes. Grants temporary levitation upon activation, agility +10%, evasion +5%. Lasts for 10 seconds. Although the addition of a magic cloak wasn't cheap, it was still much easier than adding 3 layers of magic circles to the armor. Moreover, the magic cloak gave a huge boost to dexterity by 10% and evasion by 5%. Although it only lasted for a short 10 seconds, it was easy to imagine how much damage a tree elf archer would suffer if he suddenly activated this ability while being approached by cavalry or infantry. Presumably, their opponents would be shocked. The cost of the armor was around 2,000 tor, and 300 sets would be around 600,000 tor. With Brando's current output, It would only take him half a year to fully equip the tree elves with Schaflund's silver mines. However, the benefits of the tree elf archers equipped with the new equipment would definitely far exceed the investment of 600,000 tor. Money could still be earned, but special forces were as rare as nests in wound. Brando firmly believed that good steel should be spent on the blade's edge. Moreover, the magic crystal mine would soon be put into operation. The Dark Forest could produce 3 standard units of magic crystals per day, and it was considered a super-rich mine. Even though the magic ores are currently being used up by the territory, I believe that it will soon be full. I'm preparing to sell the excess magic ores to the outside world. After all, these magic ores are used as hard currency in any era in the Amber Sword's history, and this will be a huge fortune. A standard production of magic crystals per day was 1 flame-patterned agate, or 10 lesser moon crystals. In the long run, Brando didn't think that he would always be short on money. Once the Dark Forest was developed, it would be a huge fortune, but what he needed was a strong army to protect the wealth that belonged to Erewhon. Excuse me, my lord. At this time, Carglass finally shifted his gaze away from the light spirits flying up and down in the hall. He always felt that his choice to follow Brando was the wisest decision, because there were so many new and interesting things around him. Of course, only Brando could tolerate his captain's attention being diverted to irrelevant things during a serious discussion. For example, when Carglass was telling jokes to Monica, Brando pretended not to see it. If it was any other lord of Aween or Kurlutz in this era, they would have kicked Carglass out of the hall and asked him to reflect on how he had violated the rules of nobility. However, Brando was undoubtedly the most suitable master for Carglass. He only asked, "Is there anything else, Carglass?" "Of course," Carglass replied. "I have a letter for you, my lord." "A letter for me?" Brando was stunned. His men wouldn't write him a letter for no reason. The only person who would write him a letter could only be that person. He looked at the letter that Carglass took out and couldn't help but stare blankly. What did the princess in history write to him this time? P.S. Unfortunately, I was delayed by some matters. Fortunately, I still managed to write a chapter. So today's update is too late. I apologize to everyone, I'm sorry. If I remember correctly, there are still 4 more chapters to go. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 499. You yearn for Erewhon's flag, but as the daughter of King Oberg and the princess of the royal family, I cannot answer you. My lord, you have fulfilled your promise in Tonajal, and you have set a good example. Now that the north is filled with rebels, and the kingdom is on the verge of collapse, as a direct descendant of the House of Corvado, I cannot back down. I am grateful for your trust. If hope still exists in Erewhon, then it must be in our hearts. This letter is to give you an answer. I promise to change this kingdom, even if it costs me everything. Princess Grafine Corvado gently closed the letter, her face calm, as if her worries did not exist in this decaying ship that was about to sink. However, this was only the calm before the storm. The storm was gathering in the sky, and it was about to set off a raging wave. There was a knock on the door, and a servant in a red robe asked the princess for the 3rd time. The carriage was already waiting outside the palace, and Oberway Makarov and the other important officials had been waiting for a long time. The meeting with Duke Arek was imminent. In the current Aween, there was no one else as important as this person who could change the balance of the entire balance of the balance. Grafine did not expect the young people in Vladapace to change the situation, and now Erewhon only had the army loyal to Vernon that could contend against the alliance of the northern dukes. It was not that her half-brother did not try to rope Arek into his camp, but he could not offer such a high price. Grafine knew the old fox's plan. He needed her to give birth to an heir with royal blood to legally take over Erewhon's throne. Ever since the 10 Years' Edict, the family had been plotting for this position for a long time. However, she would rather have blood flowing in front of the throne than allow such a thing to happen. Those who betrayed the sacred oath could never inherit the glorious flag, and this was a stain on the oath of the Lionheart. Furthermore, Arek had been secretly involved with the All for One for many years. They thought they were foolproof, but this kind of thing could never be kept secret. The half-elf princess, who was still in her teenage years, couldn't help but curl her lips into a tight arc. There was a kind of silent mockery in her eyes. It was almost the season where the snow melted, and if they continued to delay, a wreck would be pushed to the other side. She was the princess of the royal family, and she had already made her choice. Griffine lowered her head, and stretched out her slender fingers, and gently stroked the soft hair on her brother's forehead. Sister. Erwin's future heir looked up, and under the light of the mutton fat candle, he looked uneasily at his sister. You will be the king, Haruz, the princess said. I know. You said it before, I'm the king of Aween. The boy replied. Yes, Griffine's sister said. No one can change the countries as for the revival, Ives. Griffine's for the future. But you must be strong for one to be strong. She looked up, and her silver eyes seemed to have seen through the storm in front of her, and saw a gloomy ending. Assassinations, conspiracies, and a bloody rose on the throne. But after the storm there must be new life on the land. Yes, I've become stronger, and I practice swordsmanship every day. The boy looked up and saw the letter in his sister's hand. Sister, who are you writing to? A knight. I'm going to be a knight in the future. After a year of wandering and leaving the royal family, the boy had learned to be sharp and cunning. He looked at his sister, the princess. They said you're going to Ampere Seal? Yes. What will I do if you go? You should learn to make some decisions by yourself. Do you remember what I told you? You're a man, Haruz, you have to take the helm. Griffine replied. Oh, the boy was a little disappointed. Then you have to come back soon, or there will be no one to test my swordsmanship. Griffine couldn't help but smile. Her weak brother had learned to beat around the bush. That? He. The future successor of Aween seemed to want to continue this topic, but he hesitated and stuttered. Him. I'm talking about that knight. Will he protect you? What are you trying to say? Griffine glared at her brother. She was very scary when she was angry, and the boy couldn't help but shrink back. I don't want you to marry Duke Arek. Why? Griffine was a little surprised. Her cowardly brother wouldn't say such things to her. She couldn't help but suspect that someone was telling him to say such things, but it didn't seem to be necessary. Whether it was Makarov or her teacher, the wise old man, they all hoped to get Arek's help. They could see the poison behind the honey, but their motives were clear. Griffine didn't want to reject their wishful thinking, because at least she still needed the support of the nobles. Erwin was still Erwin of the nobles. The boy shook his head. I don't like him. Why? You haven't seen him before. No. I've heard. The boy stared at her and said hesitantly, What did you hear? They said that Duke Arek had a few wives and they all died. They said that the Duke is a vampire who drinks the blood of women. Sister. The boy's aura of being Erwin's future successor faded, and he became an ordinary and cowardly boy. He looked at his sister anxiously. Nonsense. Griffine reprimanded. But this reprimand was a little weak. The boy sensed that with his sister's personality, she wouldn't care if it was nonsense. But he didn't understand what marriage meant to a 16-year-old girl. Even if she accepted it, she was still afraid of the unknown. At this time the servant knocked on the door for the 4th time. The firm knocking seemed to balance the stone in her heart. She took a deep breath and became firm again. Griffine touched Haruz's forehead. She stood up, and a maid combed her hair and wrinkles in her clothes. The princess stretched out her hands, overcoming all external factors, and didn't let the calmness of the Covardo family go out of shape. This was her choice. When she went out, a young knight from the Royal Academy said in a low voice, Your Highness, even if you stay in the academy, we are willing to fight to the death. The glory of the Erwin royal family doesn't need to bend over a treacherous person. But Griffine looked back and replied calmly, Erwin doesn't need to shed the blood of the future, because that time hasn't come yet. Then she lifted her skirt and walked into the carriage, leaving behind a thin figure. But it was these weak shoulders that in the near future would carry the hope of Erwin's revival. Brando gently closed the letter with his thumb and forefinger and sighed softly. It was as if time had turned back, and this moment had returned to the starting point of everything. This was the moment that would decide Aween's future. The stage it played in the past had not changed today, but who could be sure where the future would lead? Erwin's hope lies in our hearts. He repeated this sentence a few times, but his heart was also at a loss. Erwin's hope existed in the hearts of everyone who fought for it, but dreams couldn't change everything. He had personally experienced the pain of powerlessness. This time he had to take control of his own fate. Carglass stood aside and looked at his lord. He had never seen such an expression on Brando's face. The young lord had always been calm and confident. He wanted to see what was written in the letter in Brando's hand, but unfortunately, he couldn't. The letter was magically processed, and he could only see a blank page. Whose letter is this? He couldn't help but ask. It's a letter from Princess Graphine. She was very pleased with how we embarrassed the Earl in Tonagel. Brando recovered in an instant. After experiencing so many dangers and hardships, he had grown up and was no longer the Sophie who was easily swayed by emotions. Carglass looked at his lord suspiciously. I won't be fooled this time. If the princess would write a letter to rebels like us, then wouldn't those who were hanged on Pine Avenue from Anwar be loyal and righteous? Brando couldn't help but look at him when he heard Carglass comparing himself to those bandits. Didn't I say that I'm the princess' secret knight? Then I'm the dark dragon's attendant. Carglass didn't think much of it. Brando opened his mouth and stared at him in shock. What's wrong? No, I'm thinking. Did you secretly learn astrology from Amandina? You're not going to say that I guessed right again, are you? Haha, you can't fool me with this old trick. Carglass suddenly felt that his lord was too interesting. He actually said that he was the dark dragon. Carglass thought that it was an extremely clever joke. But no matter how clever the joke was, it was interrupted by the tinkling of bells. Brando looked up and saw a few silver orchids swaying on the wall of the hall. He turned around and looked at Monique. Those are communication orchids. Someone is approaching from outside, my lord. Monique sat on his shoulder and said, Why wasn't there before? We planted them. Valhalla is also the home of the light spirits. We plan to plant some more chandelier orchids later. Brando caught a glimpse of his attendant at the entrance of the hall. The Shire held a staff in his hand and wore a red gilded robe. Behind him was the cowering Mordenkainen holding his duck familiar. This place is not bad. It's similar to your old home in Dardanelle, my lord. The Shire walked into the hall calmly and looked around. He raised his staff and praised. My old home in Dardanelle? Brando's teeth ached. The Highland Knight's White Knight was stationed in Dardanelle. But when he looked at his attendant's serious face, he almost thought that he had an old home in Karsuk. He stared at the Shire in annoyance, but the young Highland wizard ignored him and bowed to him. Congratulations, my lord. It's been a long and arduous journey, but now we finally have a place to stand. Congratulations, I have another piece of good news for you. Good news? You'd better take a look at this, my lord. The Shire took out an item. Brando immediately stood up from behind the desk. The cards of fate. I'll go out and come back at night to continue. I know many people say that I don't plan well, and that I don't inform you when I'm doing something. Well, that's a flaw that deserves to be criticized. Well, I'm just a little aimless. I'll try my best to pay more attention in the future. To be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 500. The exquisite card was gray with cloud patterns. It had a golden edge and was as thin as a feather. It was painted with the towering walls of the black city of Lutsai, and the volcano as the background. Brando put it down, and the sunlight that had been blocked out was able to shine through the skylight. It was cut into a pool of golden fragments and sprinkled on the wizard's crimson robe opposite him. Acronia's Furnace of Adversity, Paradise of Adversity 3, any third barrier. Lair when the furnace enters the field, attach it to the land card. Tap any 2. Sacrifice an Acronia soldier to give the furnace 2 points of energy. When travelers pass through the Great Plains, the Lutsai volcano in the north is shrouded in dark clouds all day long. This is a group of mercenaries found it at the entrance of the underground city. They knew that my men were looking for something similar, so they sent it over. The underground city is in the mountains near the silver mine. I suspect that there will be more cards of fate there. The Shire used telepathy to communicate. This card should be created by a planeswalker called Kelsey. He was one of the most outstanding planeswalkers in the past 3,000 years. He created a dark world called the Plains of Acronia. Acronia's Adversity is a very famous set of black and white cards. This card is part of the set and is used in conjunction with the other cards. Brando looked at his wizard attendant. Why haven't I heard you mention this before? I only found out recently after I leveled up. The Shire shrugged. Is this set of cards very powerful? Of course. Acronia is one of the best planeswalkers in history. If we can find his legacy, we'll be rich, the Shire replied. Brando was not so optimistic. In the past, there were many underground cities in Shaflund, but this did not change the fact that this was a newbie area. The underground ruins of the Rune Dwarves in the Shaflund silver mine were a special case. The value of the treasures in other places was still a question. You didn't go deeper? The mercenaries only went near the entrance. The room behind was filled with silt and was difficult to continue. From the looks of it, it should be a tomb that doesn't belong to our era. Sealed-off area? Brando's interest was piqued. Sealed areas were often unexplored dungeons. The first exploration would yield good results. However, the card in his hand seemed to have formed an indissoluble bond with the tomb. Wouldn't that mean that he would have to change his class to become a tomb raider in the future? Then let's go take a look. How did you get here? The conversation between the two only lasted for a moment, and only Falair knew about it. The others only felt that the hall had quieted down. Then they saw Brando raise his head and sweep his gaze across the entire hall. Of course it's the carriage, my lord. The Shire smiled. Brando nodded and looked at Carglass. Carglass. I'm here. What's the matter? Carglass, who was distracted as usual, snapped back to reality and looked at him. Brando felt pain in the corner of his eyes. As one of the most serious nobles in Erewhon, it's really fortunate that your father didn't kick you out of the house. The young man laughed and scratched his head. Prepare a ship for Ampere Seal. A ship for Ampere Seal. Carglass reacted quickly. I'm going to Ampere Seal? My lord, do you have any orders for me? He asked with a smile. It's not you, it's me. What? My lord, you're leaving ABs for Ampere Seal? Why? You talk too much. Are you going or not? Brando asked in annoyance. This guy was one of the best young men in Tonagel in all aspects, but he was so lazy that it gave people a headache. He couldn't help but pity Sir Maxen. That old man must have been furious a lot. Carglass shrugged. Of course I'm going. Why wouldn't I go? This is my lord's order. A merchant ship for Ampere Seal. I understand. I'll tell them it's just a group of ordinary guests. That's more like it. Brando turned back to look at Fanny. Do you like this place? He had already heard the conversation between the tree elf girl and Medisha. Fanny nodded. The tree elf archers were left behind by the druids to stay in Abes for a long time. They also wanted to find a suitable place to live. But Valhalla isn't big enough. It's fine. It doesn't matter if it's nearby, my lord. The female elf archer said generously. Her words reminded Brando of something. He had the idea of moving the residents of the Green Village over. The Erewhon people in the territory were still unable to receive the Senia people, and they couldn't stay in the sawmill for too long. He asked the Silver Fairy Princess to handle this matter. Medisha was now the commander of the Tree Elves, and she had the ability to do so. After arranging everything, Brando followed the Shire into the carriage, followed by Scarlet and the Roman. Scarlet was always by his side, as if she could only feel safe by his side. The little Roman was the same. He was like a little burden. The underground city was located in a valley. It took 3 hours to travel from Shaflund, and there were no roads nearby. Thus, the group had to walk through the lush forest for half a day before the Emerald Valley appeared in front of them. The valley faced north and south, connected by rolling hills. There was a stream below, and there were a few scattered tents in the forest on both sides. The Shire's apprentices and a group of mercenaries were stationed here to prevent local adventurers from getting there first. The person in charge of this group was the young Magus whose companion was killed by Grodin. He was born in a noble family, but after Grodin's death, he stayed in the Shire to learn magic. He changed his name to Lillian, a name he had forgotten. Today, he was one of the most outstanding apprentices in the Shire. The young Magus bowed respectfully to Brando. Brando had seen him before, and he had a deep impression of his silent, angry eyes. But at this moment there was only humility. "My lord, the tomb is at the bottom of the valley. It's buried in the mountains, and there are only a few round pillars outside." The mercenaries dug a tunnel that leads directly to the tomb. The tunnel is about 50 meters deep, and it leads to 3 vertical cellars. There's a lot of silt in there, and it's difficult to enter. I ordered my men to use detection magic and metal in the area outside, but they didn't find anything. Lillian explained clearly. Brando was pleasantly surprised. It was easy to find a dozen experienced mercenaries in Tanajul, but it was rare to find someone who was smart and knowledgeable. These people were either monks from the Holy Cathedral or nobles. It was fortunate that they didn't cause trouble for him. As he listened, he looked up and observed the surroundings. The stream in the valley would rise during the rainy season, and it should be able to reach their location. Thus, he deduced that the silt in the tomb was from the river. However, he didn't care too much about Lillian's explanation. The cards of fate couldn't be detected by magic, and only planeswalkers could. "Didn't you dig through the silt?" "No, my lord. There's a magic barrier behind the silt. We tried all kinds of methods but we couldn't open it." Lillian replied with some difficulty. "A magic barrier?" Brando was interested. "Bring me to see it." "As you wish, my lord." The young magus bowed and replied. The entrance to the tomb was at the other end of the camp. As they walked through the camp, the mercenaries looked at Brando with admiration. They knew that this young lord was someone who didn't fear authority. He dared to go against Count Randall just because of a promise he made to a little girl. As for Count Randall's reaction, there were still many nobles waiting to be ransomed in the dungeons of Abes. The news of him killing 2 of Count Randall's gold-ranked swordsmen with 2 strikes of his sword had spread throughout the kingdom. This is a real man. Everyone thought so when they saw Brando at this moment. However, Brando was surprised to see the female mercenary leader in the camp. The red-haired and blue-eyed Yuta wore a white shirt and tight trousers that outlined the curves of her lower body. She wore a wide belt and a pair of long riding boots, making her look like a female pirate. She tied her warhorse to a tree and swung her long hair back. She was slightly surprised when she saw Brando. The mines are too boring. I heard that there's a tomb here, so I came to take a look. I didn't expect to be discovered the first time I slacked off. My luck is really bad." Yuta looked around. Some of the mercenaries were originally her subordinates. "But your prestige is getting higher and higher, my lord." Brando coughed. This female mercenary leader's figure was a little too hot. She was wearing a shirt, and half of her snow white and full half of her breasts were exposed. It was almost tearing the shirt apart. Even Seal had a hard time averting his gaze from that cleavage, let alone Brendel. How exciting! The Shire couldn't help but sigh in relief. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. Most of his subordinates were dressed in a messy manner. The mercenaries and adventurers still followed their old habits. Now that his prestige was high, it was time to unify their battle robes. The Erewhon Kingdom's military uniform was dark blue. The private soldiers of the Erewhon Kingdom had their own habits, and most of them were based on their family emblem. However, Brando had other ideas. He nodded at Yuta. "It's fine. Since the female leader is interested, why don't we go together?" "Of course," Yuta smiled. "But my lord is too polite. I'm willing to be your knight. You can just call me by my name." Brando looked at her. "Knight? Retainer?" He could faintly feel the deeper meaning behind Yuta's words. The female mercenary leader was very carefree. Ever since Count Randner's defeat, she had completely submitted to him. Being able to follow a good lord was the dream of every mercenary. Even though she did not know Cornelius and Rabin's thoughts, she was sure that they were the same. Oh, to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 501. The entrance to the tomb was near the bottom of the valley. A few broken pillars stood in the thick bushes, covered with vines. If one did not look closely, they would have thought that they were made of green rocks. However, Brando thought that the mercenaries had dug a very professional tunnel. He used to dig this kind of tunnel before. After all, it was the physical work of a warrior and he was good at it. He observed for a while and found that the stone of the pillars was badly corroded. The small patterns on the pillars were similar to words. They were not written in the crew's language, nor were they written in the Elven language. In other words, they probably came from the history of the mountain people. Before the Silver Elf Empire and the Kingdom of Erwin ruled over this area, the original inhabitants of this area were the mountain people. The history of this place could be traced back to before the War of the Holy Saints. This tomb probably had a long history. It was a pity that he did not invest much in history. His scholar level was mostly in heraldry and aristocratic knowledge. He used to disguise himself as a nobleman, but now he thought that it was not worth it. The wizards under Lyrian's command had already created a magic ball of light. The group entered the tomb. The air in the tomb had been expelled for a long time, but the smell of decay still lingered in the air. The light was a little dim. They followed the dim light into a tomb cellar. Rows of side niches appeared on both sides of the passage. They were filled with skeletons and remains, some of which had been destroyed. Brando found the card in his hand in one of these niches. He sensed for a while and found nothing. However, the faint smell of magic in front of him made his heart beat faster. The Shire walked side by side with him. Scarlet and Yuta walked on his left and right respectively. The female mercenary leader gripped her long sword tightly. Her emerald green eyes seemed to be burning under the light of magic. Scarlet gripped the spear in her hand tightly. Through her amber eyes, the girl quietly monitored the movements in the darkness. The smell of decay grew stronger and stronger, gradually making people uneasy. Roman grabbed his hand tightly, but his eyes were sparkling with excitement as he looked around. The sand in the tomb had been dug up. Soon there was light in front of them. Brando walked closer and saw that it was an agate light barrier. Lines of runes flashed on it. It was thick in the middle and thin on both sides. It was obviously some kind of magic barrier. Is this the magic barrier? He turned around and asked. That's right, my lord. We've tried all sorts of methods, but we're still unable to remove this barrier. Schiller hurriedly replied. This spell was Chaos Crystal Wall, a level 6 law spell. The caster was at least a level 40 law wizard. It would be strange if Lilien's apprentices and warlocks could break it apart. Can you open it? Brando turned to ask the Shire. Simple, the Shire replied casually. Now. Brando nodded. The young wizard servant began to chant. He reached out his hand and gently touched the magic wall. With his finger as the center, a black hole appeared on the agate light barrier. The area of the black hole quickly expanded, and in an instant, the entire magic barrier disappeared. The tomb was silent for a moment. Easy. He should only be a 6th ring wizard, the Shire replied. He was a 7th ring wizard. 1 ring was enough to make a world of difference. This spell doesn't look like a defense. It looks more like a seal, Brando said. Why? The Shire did not understand. Because the Chaos Crystal Wall is a very strong defensive spell. It's more like a barrier that prevents foreign objects from entering. If it's a defensive mechanism, it's at least a little offensive. The Shire of course did not know that Brando had seen many defensive spells set up in the underground city. You even know about this spell, my lord? Of course. I'm a Highland knight, Brando replied nonchalantly. It was the Shire's turn to feel uncomfortable. He clearly knew that the person standing in front of him was not a Highland wizard. But the people around him did not doubt it. Other than a Highland knight, who would bring a wizard servant through the streets and be so knowledgeable about mysterious magic? After breaking the magic barrier, Brando continued to lead the group forward. This time he was much more cautious. Seals and defenses were different. Defenses were dangerous, but seals meant that there were unknown dangers in the tomb. Seals were more or less mysterious. In the whole of Erwin, there were not many places that were used to suppress evil spirits. The most famous one was the underground public tomb in Ampere Seal. Another tomb. Brando felt that today was really strange. Behind the curtain of light was a huge tomb. Under the pale light, more than 10 stone pillars stood quietly in the dark and quiet hall. They were already covered with cobwebs. In this dusty world, in addition to the densely packed niches on the sides, there were many stone coffins in the middle of the hall. According to the barbarian customs, these should be the sacrificial lambs of a higher status. Brando used detection magic to check the whole hall. There were 3 or 4 flashing lights in the corner, but none of them were cards of fate. Flies were still meat, And there were also good things in low-level underground cities. He pointed out the location, and the Magi immediately began to search the room. But someone seemed to have touched something, and there was a sudden creaking sound in the silent hall. Brendel quickly saw a few dark figures pushing open the coffin lids and climbing out from within. "It's tomb ghouls!" The Magi's apprentices shouted with pale faces. Tomb ghouls were a mutation of ghouls. They were level 27 undead creatures, and their strength was infinitely close to the peak of black iron. Moreover, the humanoid creatures they killed would become undead creatures in a very short time. For adventurers, they were definitely one of the most dangerous creatures in the underground city. Brando looked at the Magi's apprentices in front of him, who were in a panic because of the shock, and could not help but think of his first adventure. Because the scene in the underground city was too realistic, a few of his friends and a giant demon were scared witless and ran away. Thinking of the past, he could not help but laugh. On the other hand, the Shire only felt embarrassed when he saw this scene. These Magi's apprentices were all his subordinates, and if his subordinates were too embarrassed, he would be the one to lose face. What's with the chaos? He finally could not help but growl. Are you all just waiting to die? The Magi in front of him finally reacted. The tomb ghouls had already climbed up the nearest stone pillar to the ceiling. The wooden beams above crisscrossed and it was pitch black. It was impossible to see where these monsters were hiding. One of the Magi first put up a wizard's wall, and then the hall was filled with a large shield, stone armor, water shield, and light wall. Put the magic balls up there. Laron immediately ordered. Several balls of light immediately flew to the top of the ceiling. The tomb ghouls usually like to hide in the dark and launch sudden attacks, but this time they had nowhere to hide. Their hunched bodies were immediately exposed to the light, and the monsters immediately let out a shrill squeak. 6, 7, 8 There are 8 of them. The Magi began to cast spells, but the tomb ghouls were the first to pounce on them. A few of them were knocked to the ground. Although the tomb ghouls' sharp teeth could not penetrate their shields, the scene was already filled with cries and screams. Scarlet stared at the monsters and threw the spear in her hand. It pierced through 3 tomb ghouls and nailed them to the wall on the other side. On the other side, Yuta had also killed her way into the crowd. Her strength was close to that of a mid-level silver. She was not outstanding among Brando's subordinates, but she was more than enough to deal with these mere level 27 undead creatures. In an instant, several tomb ghouls that had grabbed onto the Shire's Magi had their heads pierced through by her sword. The remaining 2 tomb ghouls wanted to retreat into the depths of the tomb, but the Magi who had prepared their spells would not let them do as they wished. All kinds of lights flashed in the hall, and the 2 tomb ghouls were smashed into pieces by countless magic arrows, ice bolts, fire arrows, and lightning claws. The scene was so spectacular that even Brando was a little stunned. The Shire could only wipe the sweat off his forehead. The battle started quickly, but it also ended quickly. There were a few skeletons standing up from the side of the wall. If it was back in Gerald's tomb, Brando would have had a hard time dealing with these skeletons. But here, even the weakest of his mercenaries could easily dismantle them. After the battle, the Magi found a few magic amulets in the positions pointed out by Brando. They were all alchemy-grade trinkets. They should be used to ward off evil spirits. Brando didn't care about these things anymore, so he directly gave them to the Magi's apprentice Magi, causing a burst of cheers. The last item to be presented was a magic sword. Brando was slightly startled when he saw the magic sword. The body of the sword was crimson red and sparkling like agate. The guard of the sword was a pair of fire ravens, and the sword hilt was surrounded by flame patterns. At first glance, it was obvious that this was a rare treasure. He recognized this magic sword. Fire Raven's tongue. This was a brass-grade magic sword. The quality of the sword itself was not bad, and the rare thing about it was that it could shoot out a flaming whip. In the early stages of the game, it was considered a rare equipment. Brando saw that Yuta didn't have a suitable sword, so he simply gave it to the female mercenary group leader. My lord. Yuta was slightly startled, but she was pleasantly surprised when she received the sword. In this era, low magic items were very common, but brass grade and above were the real treasures. She knew that Brando had the Halran Gaia, but this sword could also be given to a close subordinate. She didn't expect that Brando would give it to her without hesitation. She gently stroked the body of the sword. There was no swordsman who didn't love swords, let alone such a good sword. Thank you, I will cherish it, Yuta said with a rare seriousness. But Brando didn't think so much. In his eyes, brass grade equipment was just an ordinary magic item. He regarded Yuta as one of his own. Not to mention brass grade equipment, if it was suitable, he wouldn't hesitate to give it to her even if it was silver grade equipment. At this time, the wizard who was scouting ahead ran back and said breathlessly, My lord, there is a tomb in front. The Shire saw these embarrassing subordinates and simply turned his face away, pretending that he didn't see them. Of course, he thought that when he went back, it would be time to train these guys' abilities. He felt that he was too relaxed before. Tomb. Brando didn't care about the performance of these wizard apprentices. His own first adventure was even worse than this. Looking at these wizards, he felt a sense of familiarity as if he was looking at a newbie in the game. The Amber Sword was a very lively game, and rookies and newbies were always everywhere. Yes, tomb, there is no road behind. That's it? Brando couldn't help but be startled. He didn't expect the tomb to be so short, but after thinking about it, he understood. In the past, there were many small dungeons like this in the game. After all, this was a tomb, not a maze. Not every tomb was comparable to the public crypt under Ampere seal. After all, the Amber Sword's first goal was authenticity. What is the tomb like? He asked again. There is a big stone coffin inside, the wizard apprentice said. And a lot of those cards. Oh, to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 502. After passing through a hall full of cobwebs and dust, the tomb was located at the end of the underground city. Generally speaking, it was the place where the boss monster was. As soon as Brando entered the tomb, he instinctively felt that something was wrong. The tomb was very small, with a length and width of only a few dozen steps. The whole structure was square, and a huge sarcophagus quietly stopped in the middle of the room on a stone platform protruding from the ground. The architectural style of the tomb was the same as the tomb outside, but the atmosphere in the tomb was clearly oppressive. Under the dim light, the narrow space seemed to be filled with an evil aura. The air was condensed to the freezing point, and even the flames of the torches were suppressed out of thin air. This was the aura of the boss monster, but it was much stronger than Brando had expected. This was not the aura that a level 30 boss monster should have. However, Brando looked around and did not find the boss monster. He could only guess that the boss monster should be in the sarcophagus in the middle. He pulled out Halrangaya and placed it flat to block the people behind him, indicating that they should not act rashly. Then he turned his head and asked, "Where are the cards?" "Over there, my lord." The sorcerer apprentice immediately pointed to the other side of the sarcophagus. Brando then noticed the remains of a skeleton lying in the shadows. Because the tomb was full of such skeletons, he did not notice this detail before. Now that he was reminded, he immediately noticed that the remains were different from the others. The people buried in this tomb should be slaves. Most of them did not wear any luxurious clothes. Even if they did, most of them would have been charred and turned into dust with the passage of time. However, the skeleton was wearing a robe that was intact, and there was a staff by its hand. Brando recognized at a glance that it was a sorcerer. Other than sorcerers, very few people would use a precious material like magic blackwood to make a staff. There were a few shining cards scattered around the skeleton. They were the cards of fate, and there were a total of 5 of them. It was not strange for a wizard to carry a card of fate, and this was not the first time he found one in a spellcaster's belongings. Wizards were a group of people who were full of curiosity and exploration towards all the mysterious things in this world. They would often collect strange little things that even they themselves couldn't recognize. Every year, many people would lose their lives because of this. At least Brando had heard of people who were cursed because they collected statues of evil gods. Therefore, it was not hard to understand why Magi would collect some mysterious cards. "Can I use some kind of spell to get it?" Brando asked. He instinctively felt that this tomb was somewhat dangerous. There were many kinds of commander-tier monsters. Some of them were very troublesome and knew how to set traps. Although there were only tomb ghouls outside, there was no guarantee that the owner of this tomb would not be a high-tier sudden death spirit. He did not want to enter the enemy's main battlefield and fight it. More importantly, this tomb gave him a very indescribable feeling. He had experienced the calamity of wolves. Even when faced with a tide of bearing beasts, he was not as nervous as he was now. The danger in the air seemed to condense into needles, piercing his heart. He had been in hundreds and thousands of dungeons and was very sensitive to danger. He instinctively felt that there was something strange about this tomb. Although from the outside entrance, this should be a level 30 enhanced dungeon. In theory, the boss should be a gold tier commander tier monster. But there was no guarantee that nothing would go wrong. No one could guarantee that they would not make a mistake. Especially after going deeper into the tomb, Brando found that the tomb's history was unbelievably long. If this tomb existed before the rule of Erwin and the Silver Elves, then it had at least been around for thousands of years. For things like tombs and dungeons, the longer the history, the stranger the monsters inside. The Amber Sword was very realistic in this aspect. Brando had to be careful. He trusted his own judgment and experience. The apprentices shook their heads in unison. "We've tried, my lord." One of them mustered up the courage to answer. "But the sarcophagus seems to have some power that can dispel our magic. As soon as our magic gets close to the sarcophagus, it immediately disappears." "Disappears?" Brando asked. "Is it dispelled?" "No, we don't feel that our magic has been dispelled." Rather than saying, "It's more like we've been cut off," an apprentice replied. "Blocking mental power, it should be a psionic ability." Brando immediately concluded that psionic magic was the most famous, followed by holy words and witchcraft. In the Amber Sword, the ghosts were famous for creating illusions using their psychic powers. They could distort people's minds and magnify their fear by 1,000 times. When you felt their cold fingertips pass through your chest, you would have already turned into ice. It wasn't because of the cold, but because your heart had fallen into eternal darkness. Therefore, the sarcophagus might really be the spirit lord. So Brando thought for a moment and took out the white deer statue from his pocket. Everyone saw a white deer emitting a fluorescent light appear in the tomb. The accompanying mercenaries were shocked at first, but when they realized that it was their lord's summoned creature, they were relieved. But when they looked at Brando, their eyes were inexplicably filled with awe. The white deer was a holy spirit in Owen's legends, and those who were blessed by the white deer would often become heroes in the legends. This kind of saying was especially popular among the people in the south, because there would occasionally be people who would witness the white deer in the forest. After the white deer appeared, it retreated slightly and uneasily dug its hooves into the ground. Its behavior made Brando frown. The white deer holy spirit was the nemesis of all evil creatures. The leader of the monsters in the sarcophagus actually made it feel uneasy. Brando immediately became alert. All the details proved that his initial intuition was not wrong. There was definitely something strange about this tomb. He could not help but look at the Shire. When they were breaking the seal on the outside, the two of them had already noticed that something was wrong. Do you want us to go and get those things, my lord?" The wizard apprentice at the side observed Brando's expression and asked with some trepidation. Anyone could see that there was something strange about this tomb. No one knew what kind of danger they would encounter if they went in. Adventuring in underground tombs was originally an extremely dangerous thing. Terrifying evil creatures and fatal curses had taken the lives of countless adventurers. However, Brando's reputation in Abyss was unparalleled. If he gave an order, most of the wizards and adventurers present would blindly trust him. But Brando shook his head. Although he was now the lord of a territory, and in name or perhaps in the eyes of the northern princess, he was considered an outstanding noble. If Amandina was here, she would definitely warn him that it was not the right thing to do to put himself in danger. But in essence, he was still a simple-minded player and a simple youth from the countryside of Braggs. No matter what the excuse was, sending people to die in a trap was not something a normal player would do to an intelligent and thoughtful NPC. Besides, if it was so easy to take out the spoils of war, then this sarcophagus would not be here. At present, it seemed that only by killing the boss in the sarcophagus would they have a chance to get the treasure here. This was the most basic setting of a game. Although Wond was no longer a game, it was still born out of the Amber Sword. At least until now, Brando did not see that this world was too different from the original world. "All of you back off. This is not a battle you can participate in." He turned around and pointed his sword at the others and gave the order. At the same time, he gave the Shire a look, indicating that the two of them should approach from the left and right. He decided to open the sarcophagus first to see what the monster was. But this order made everyone present stunned. They had never seen a lord who would go first when faced with danger. Of course, most of them felt strange. Brando's actions were somewhat out of place in the traditional view of this world. Or to put it bluntly, he did not seem like a lord or a noble. But no one talked about it. There was only silence. At least everyone could understand the benevolence and righteousness contained in this order. Although everyone understood that in the struggle between nobles, only those with a heart as hard as iron could really reach the top. But in fact, no one wanted to follow a person who was cold-blooded and ruthless to the people around him. The young mage Lyrian saw this scene and could not help but hold his breath. He was born into a noble family. In his impression, his father was a small noble who was busy making friends all day long. He had also seen those shrewd and serious nobles. But the Brando he knew was completely different from all the nobles he had seen. In fact, the mercenaries around him, and even the wizards, did not doubt that Brando was a real noble. Yes, because the Lord was knowledgeable and knew almost everything. Only nobles could have such a deep family knowledge. But in Lyrian's opinion, it was not so. With his attentiveness and sharpness, it was not difficult for him to find a side of Brando that did not fit in with the nobles. That was why he once suspected that Brando was not a noble. Of course, this suspicion could not explain Brando's knowledge and calm attitude, nor could it shake his loyalty to this lord. But it always made him puzzled. But until now he was sure. Ever since Brando turned around and pointed his sword at them and gave the order, he suddenly saw the brilliance of a true noble from the sword. It was not a temperament that the nobles of today's Erewhon could have. It was the demeanor of the ancient nobles. The king and the nobles' swords always walked in front of their people. They held the flag high and led their ancestors to cut through the thorns in the darkness, walking on a path to order and light. In the darkness, the blood of the nobles flowed. That was the path of the ancient sages. Lyrian looked at the backs of Brando and the Shire and could not help but take a step forward. But at this time, Brando and the Shire had already placed their hands on the sarcophagus, one on the left and one on the right. At this time, the temperature in the tomb suddenly dropped. Everyone could feel a layer of frost growing on the walls of the tomb at a speed visible to the naked eye. In the blink of an eye, there was a thick layer of snow. In just a moment, everyone's teeth started to chatter. Damn it, what the hell is this? Brendel's strange yell shattered the noble image that he had built up in Lyrian's mind. His noble demeanor vanished like a puff of smoke, and he returned to being the lord who made a fuss over nothing. Of course, Lyrian did not know that this image was called a player, and he would never know. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 503. When Brando and the Shire got close to the sarcophagus, a chill came from the sarcophagus. This chill was completely different from the chill of nature that he had experienced in the mountain area of Alcash. An evil thought went straight to the bottom of his heart, making his hair stand on end. What the hell is this? Brando was shocked and immediately felt an evil thought enter his spiritual world. Mortal, submit to me. A majestic and heavy voice sounded from the bottom of his heart, like thunder rolling from the sky, with boundless pressure. Not good mind control. Brando was alarmed. Mind control spells were an extremely evil type of dark witchcraft. By erasing the soul and memory, they could turn individuals with free will into slaves of the spellcaster. This type of spell completely despised the dignity of life itself. As early as 700 years ago, it was explicitly forbidden to study and use. Nowadays, only a few cultists and a few necromancers would secretly study it, but Brando never dreamed that there would be a cultist or a necromancer lying in the sarcophagus. Even as early as 1,000 years ago, necromancers and cultists did not dare to openly build a mausoleum for themselves, not to mention that necromancers mostly pursued immortality. Among the countless necromancers who had fallen over the centuries, more than half of them had died unnatural deaths. Necromancers also did not believe that souls could rest in peace on the earth. Crawl, tremble, weep helplessly for your sins, and accept the boundless anger between heaven and earth. The thunder-like voice screamed. Brando had already calmed down. The heavy pressure in the spiritual world had formed an endless giant in front of him. He looked up and found that he and the giant were standing on a boundless pitch-black plain. The giant raised its hand and pressed down on him like a mountain. For a moment the wind and clouds changed color, as if the center of the world was only the five-finger mountain that was getting bigger and bigger. "Get out of here!" Brando gritted his teeth and roared angrily. He knew that this was an illusion, but he could not help but break out in cold sweat as the giant hand came closer and closer. The feeling of reality was too strong, and even the wind pressure was suffocating him. In theory, mind control spells were attacks on the mind. As long as the will was strong enough, the opponent could not do anything to him. He had a few similar experiences in the game, but unfortunately there were no successful examples. The warrior's will was too weak. Almost every time he encountered such a situation, his vision would turn black, and he would lose control of his body. When he woke up, he was already in the resurrection temple. This kind of unlucky experience was of no help to him at all, because there was no second chance in this world. Brando's nerves were taut as he prepared himself for the next earth-shattering attack. He could not help but think to himself, "I even managed to survive the calamity of wolves. Am I going to be defeated here?" While he was thinking, the giant hand pressed down on his head. The mind attack was aimed directly at the soul, ignoring almost all external defense. The warrior's mind resistance was the weakest, so it should not be able to withstand a single blow. However, what Brando did not expect was that before the giant hand could touch even a strand of his hair, it seemed to have met with a huge resistance above his head. It actually shattered into pieces with a bang. He saw with his own eyes that the palm seemed to have hit something. A crack appeared from the center, and then a few long cracks crawled out. In the blink of an eye, the palm turned into countless pieces and disappeared. "This is impossible." The thunderous voice stopped abruptly. After the giant's palm shattered, it turned into a gentle breeze and disappeared into thin air. Brando clearly felt that the terrifying mental attack was like a gentle breeze that brushed across the surface of the water. It only caused a few ripples on his mental barrier. This? Brando was stunned. His first reaction was that the monster in the sarcophagus was strong in appearance but weak in reality. However, there was obviously a problem. To be able to cast such high-level dark magic, it had to be at least at the level of the Shire. No matter what, it should not be unable to break through the mental barrier of a warrior. In fact, this was no longer a problem of not being able to break through. It did not even cause the slightest bit of impact. To put it crudely, it did not even hurt a single strand of hair. It was as if you knew that your opponent was a terrifying boss. You tensed up and waited for the fatal blow, only to find that your opponent had turned into a harmless little bunny in the blink of an eye. This contrast was a little too big. What the hell was going on? While Brando was still trying to figure out what was going on, a scream suddenly rang out from the endless darkness. "Impossible! You can't be a human. How can a human have such strong willpower? What are you?" At this moment, the loud voice in the sky actually had a hint of hoarseness, giving people the impression that it was a crazy woman who was pulling at her hair. Brando suddenly reacted. Willpower. Ha. He could not help but laugh loudly in his heart. He just remembered that his willpower attribute had been increased by 1,000 times due to Andesha injecting the blood of gods into his body. With his current willpower, this level of mental attack was simply showing off in front of an expert. If Andesha was still here, Brando felt that he would have hugged her and kissed her. This was simply too wonderful. However, he was also a little embarrassed. He had been a warrior in the game for too long, and he had gotten used to it. He did not think of this point and was almost frightened by this monster. However, he immediately sneered and looked up at the heavy dark clouds in the sky. "Who asked you to control me? My willpower is in the hundreds, and I'm basically immune to spells below the 10th circle. Even if you find a completely reconstructed silver body wizard, they might not have such high willpower." However, the world he was in right now was clearly an illusion formed by the mental domain. The monster in the sarcophagus was quite bold, and it still did not retreat. Brando immediately gritted his teeth and released a mental attack towards the sky. "Ah!" A shrill scream suddenly came from the sky. Logically speaking, Brando had not undergone any special training, and it was impossible for him to release a mental attack. However, that was referring to the attack. In fact, this world was still Brando's inner world, and it was controlled by him. Therefore, Brando's attack could be said to be a self-defense and counterattack using his willpower. Originally, in a battle on the mental domain, the invader's willpower had to be able to completely suppress the target. The funny thing was that the monster did not realize that Brando's willpower was abnormally high. It was unable to react in time and suffered a great loss under Brando's attack. Ah! With a series of screams, the monster finally escaped from the illusion, and the boundless dark plane disappeared in an instant. Brando shuddered and woke up from his mental domain. At this time he was almost soaked in cold sweat, but he immediately heard a concerned voice in his ear. Brando, what's wrong? It was Orthlis's voice. Orthlis and Brando's minds were connected, and she immediately sensed that something was wrong with Brando. However, as soon as she spoke, Brando's eyes had already cleared up. The battle in the mental domain seemed fierce, but in reality, only a moment had passed. There's a monster in the sarcophagus, and I almost fell into its trap. A mental attack? Orthlis quickly reacted and asked with a serious face. Yeah. Are you okay? I'm fine. Brando felt a little tired and exhausted, but he shook his head to show that he was fine. He believed that the monster in the sarcophagus was in a worse state than him. His willpower was more than 100 points, and it was no different from a nuclear weapon for a level 30 to 40 mental attack. He believed that even if the attack did not kill the monster, it would at least be half dead. Haha, that's true. I just remembered that you were modified by the blood of God. That monster is really unlucky. The Night Sister could not help but laugh. Brando could not help but smile bitterly, but Orthlis was right. He could not say whether he was still human or not. He was an elite and had the blood of God. He was too embarrassed to say that he was a purebred Erewhon. The Shire, are you okay? He immediately turned around to look at his mage servant. The Shire was the only one who approached the sarcophagus with him, and caused the monster to attack. He had such a high willpower defense, but the Shire did not. He was worried that the Shire would be affected, but he did not expect the Shire to be standing there looking at him nervously. You're okay. My lord, you're okay? The Shire also asked, looking a little surprised. Ah, the young servant blinked, then reacted. Mind control effects are ineffective on me. I'm just a card after all. I was worried about you, my lord. But my lord. Ahem, my lord, you're really beyond my expectations. You can even deal with a mental attack with such ease. You're really wise. Ahaha. He laughed and said. Brendel sighed helplessly. It was true that a gold-ranked warrior had a very small chance of being immune to a mind control of the same level. But this monster was unlucky to have met two weirdos like him and Seal. One of them had an extraordinarily high will, while the other was not affected by mind control at all. If there was a boss in the sarcophagus, it would probably be one of the unluckiest bosses in the Amber Sword. Thinking of this, he was ready to open the sarcophagus. Oh, to be continued. If you like this work, you're welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 504. When Brando opened the sarcophagus. At this moment, the temperature in the tomb had dropped to a certain level. A layer of white frost had formed on the walls of the tomb, and a faint gurgling sound could be heard in the darkness. Yuta, who was standing at the door with the others, was slightly startled when she heard the voice. She turned around to look for the source of the voice, only to find that it was the merchant lady beside her. Her face was pale, she was shivering from the cold, and her teeth were chattering. Are you okay? A strange look flashed across the female mercenary leader's eyes. She couldn't understand why this little girl was still standing here despite being so cold. However, she knew that the fiancé of the Lord was the weakest amongst all the people present, so she kindly asked, Do you want me to send you out first? The Roman wrapped his arms around his shoulders and shivered from the cold. However, he shook his head like a rattledrum and replied in a trembling voice, No. I want to see Bubu Brando open the coffin. I want to see what's inside the coffin. But aren't you cold? Yuta clearly saw that the other party was freezing to death. I'm cold. Then shall I walk you out? No. When Romaine answered, it was obvious that her curiosity had won over her rationality. She fully expressed that she wanted to see what was inside the sarcophagus, even if she had to be frozen into an ice sculpture. If such a concept was placed in Brando's era, she would at least be a pioneer in seeking the truth. Yuta obviously did not understand the spirit of, if one hears the truth in the morning, one can die in the evening. She looked at the strange little girl and was a little speechless for a moment. Of course, she did not know that on the night when Madara invaded Erewhon in Buchi a year ago, Brando had the same thought when he looked at the fearless little Roman. While the female mercenary leader was speechless, Brando finally pried open the lid of the sarcophagus with the help of the Shire. This huge sarcophagus was trapezoidal, similar to the style of the Egyptian pharaohs' tombs. From this point, it could be seen that it was very different from the contemporary Cruz culture. The coffins of the Cruz people were generally rectangular or hexagonal like the coffins of the vampires. The culture of the Erewhon people and the Cruz people were of the same origin, and there was not much difference. The burial customs of the mountain people generally did not require a coffin. Instead, they would dig a grave in the tomb. Therefore, Brando concluded that the tomb was probably quite old, at least before the history of the mountain people. To be on the safe side, Brando only pushed the coffin lid open a small gap, but he was immediately stunned. Because from the light from the fire that seeped through the gap, the huge sarcophagus seemed to be empty. There were no skeletons or mummies that should have occupied the main position, but there were a lot of gold and silver objects buried with them. The boss is not in here? Brando's heart was filled with doubts. He carefully gestured to the Shire beside him, and the two immediately pushed the lid open. Only then did they realize that the sarcophagus was not empty. Between the oxidized gold and silver objects, in the middle of the huge sarcophagus, where the skeletons should have been, there was a pile of crystal fragments lying quietly. When Brando saw the crystal fragments, he suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. This was because the crystal shards were actually in the shape of a human lying on a piece of cloth. It had obvious limbs and a torso but no head. "Damn, senior sister, don't scare me." Brando couldn't help but mutter in a voice that only he could hear. But no matter how he looked at it, he couldn't tell what the remains were. What the hell is this? The Shire looked at the crystal fragments in the coffin, and couldn't help but be stunned. Generally speaking, many burial customs had the habit of making the buried into a mummy, but the method of making a mummy was very strange. But to make a person into a crystal-like form was unheard of. And there was no head, which was even more strange. Brando carefully checked the inside of the coffin. Except for the human-shaped crystal fragments, there was nothing else that looked like a skeleton. If he guessed correctly, this should be the owner of this tomb. As for the burial items beside it, Brando recognized a few familiar items at a glance. They were all magic equipment. If this was in the game, these would be the reward for this boss battle. Could this be the boss? Thinking of this, he couldn't help but look at the pile of crystal fragments again. No way, although his spiritual counterattack was very sharp, but it was broken into pieces by him in a second. It can't be so weak, right? For a moment, Brando was a little confused. Not only Brando, the Shire also seemed to feel that the human-shaped crystal fragments in front of him were a little familiar. He said uncertainly in the telepathic message, "It seems like this is the thing from before, boss." Brando nodded and didn't answer. His eyes flashed, and suddenly he found an unusually familiar thing in the pile of burial items. That thing was lying in the pile of gold and silver. It was a palm-sized dark gray stone piece. Its surface was dull, and it looked like a fragment that had fallen off from the coffin lid. If Brando didn't feel a little puzzled, and his eyes scanned the stone coffin several times, he probably wouldn't have noticed such an ordinary stone piece. But he softly said, "Eh?" and picked up the thing, and suddenly found that it was very similar to something he had seen before. He hesitated for a moment, and immediately took out something from his pocket. It was also a stone piece, dull and dull. Other than the fact that it was only the size of a thumb, it was almost the same as the larger stone piece in Brando's hand. This small stone piece was a relic of Viscount Nathan that he found in the Forbidden Orchard, where the golden demonic tree was when he fled with the Roman and Freya on the Zavale mountain path. Of course, it could also be said that it was a relic of Amandina's father. He remembered that among all the relics of Amandina's father, this was the only thing he didn't recognize. At that time, he thought that this stone piece was some kind of alchemy material. After all, there were thousands of materials in the amber sword, and it was normal that he didn't recognize it. He was a combat class, not a secondary class player. But later on, according to alchemist Tamar's identification, this thing was not a mineral, nor was it similar to other alchemy materials. There was no magical reaction on it, and it was more like a normal stone piece. Brando wanted to throw it away a few times, but in the end he couldn't bear to. After all, it was obtained in a special place and it might be a storyline item. If he threw it away, he couldn't find it again. But he didn't expect that he would find something similar to this stone piece in a nameless tomb in Tonajal. What is this? This strange stone piece appeared among the grave goods, which meant that it had some value, or at least it was recognized by the tomb owner. Brando glanced at the other grave goods. Although they weren't priceless, after all, they were rewards from a level 30 dungeon, but at least most of them were magical items. The rest represented the equivalent of art, gold, silver, and pottery. This stone piece appeared in the hands of Amandina's father, and now it appeared hundreds of miles away in an ancient tomb from hundreds of years ago. The secrets of two different eras were intertwined, and Brando frowned. He thought for a long time, but he couldn't come to a conclusion. The most reasonable guess was that this stone piece was some kind of special grave goods, and it might have been given a special meaning in a certain era. Viscount Nesson happened to be an archaeologist enthusiast, and this was the only explanation. But it was a little disrespectful to the deceased. After all, there was no evidence to prove that Amandina's father was a grave robber. Moreover, Viscount Nesson always carried this ordinary stone piece with him, and placed it together with the letter he sent to Amandina. This meant that he was at least very proud of this item. Brando couldn't think of any value to this item, and it wasn't a flint spear tip from the Stone Age. Brando thought for a while, and decided to carefully keep this stone piece. At least, this strange stone piece appeared in this tomb, which meant that it had lived for a much longer time than Erewhon. Oh, there's a card of fate here. Brando suddenly heard the Shire's surprised voice through telepathy. He turned around and saw his attendant hooking his index finger into the sarcophagus. A black object flew out from the layers of spider webs. It looked like a box. On the surface of the box there was a triangle carved in yang, and on the inside of the triangle there was a circle carved in yin. The two patterns formed a strange symbol, and there were some rising flame patterns around the symbol. But his eyes flashed, and he saw a silver flash under the box. It was actually connected to a thin silver line that was almost imperceptible to the naked eye. Brando's face changed when he saw the silver line, and his voice trembled as he shouted, "Put it down!" But it was too late. The Shire had already grabbed the box in his hands, and he looked back at his master in confusion. But suddenly the entire tomb began to tremble. The floor shook violently, and the dust on the ceiling rustled down. The pillars around them began to tilt, emitting a creaking sound that made one's teeth ache. Now everyone understood what was happening. It was obvious that someone had triggered an incredible mechanism. Ah! The Shire jumped in fright. My lord, this is just an accident. To him, this was really an accident. The background of the card explained that he was actually a magus who grew up in an ivory tower. Unlike adventurers, NPC magi grew up in a vast sea of books. They had nothing to do with adventuring, and would not know where the traps in the dungeons were. But the Shire's strength made him and Brando overlook this point. And Brando had also neglected an important point. The Shire was a native, and not a player magus. Holy shit! Brando immediately cursed in his heart. He immediately said, "Don't worry about the accident. Run, this tomb is going to collapse." Most of the underground tombs in Amber Room had self-destruct mechanisms, but players with a little experience would not fall for such a trick. Now he looked at the Shire and felt a lot of sweat in his heart. The two of them looked at each other and turned around at the same time. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 505. Both of them had a tacit understanding. The moment Seal turned around, he opened his arms wide, ignoring the spiders and other multi-legged insects that were crawling around the sarcophagus. He picked up the scattered funerary objects and rushed out. Brendel, on the other hand, pounced to the side and rolled to avoid the stone slab that fell from the ceiling. He came to the side of the skeleton that was lying on the side of the sarcophagus. He got up and spat out the sand in his mouth. He looked around and saw a few cards of fate under the skeleton. At this moment the sand above his head was falling, almost burying the cards. Brando quickly reached out his hand to grab them. But as soon as he did, the eyes of the skeleton that he didn't pay attention to flashed red. It suddenly stood up and extended its claws to grab Brando's neck. Brando was taken aback. A mere skeleton was even worse than Madara's lowest-ranked skeleton soldiers. If it was any other day, Brando would not even pay attention to it. But at this moment, dozens of rocks were pouring down from above his head. If he hesitated, he would be buried alive in the grave. Right at this critical moment, a bright arrow of fire shot out from behind him. It brushed past his face and struck the skeletal claw that was gripping his neck. Sparks flew everywhere, and he felt his hair curling up from the heat. But the skeletal claw was unable to withstand this level of attack, and broke off with a loud bang. The pressure on his body was released, and he immediately grabbed the card of fates and retreated for his life. There was an earth-shattering explosion behind him. A quarter of the tomb had collapsed, and the sand had almost reached the stone platform in the middle. Brando's back was drenched in cold sweat. He quickly turned around to see who had such a strong mental fortitude to shoot out such a precise spell at such a critical moment. It was the first time he had seen such a perfect spell in the game. Seal did not have many elemental apprentices under him, and he could not think of anyone who was so daring and meticulous. But when he turned around, Brando saw a face that he couldn't have imagined. At the entrance of the tomb, the little Roman raised her index finger and waved it at him proudly. There was a wisp of flame at the tip of her finger that was dissipating. Seeing the merchant lady's expression, she wanted to say something, but she was immediately pulled away by the female mercenary commander. When did this young lady learn magic? Brando couldn't help but think that the little girl was quite talented in casting spells. Her accuracy in casting spells was something that many high-level players couldn't do. But he immediately thought of a more terrifying possibility. Perhaps the little Roman didn't even aim properly, and was just lucky that she missed. Brando couldn't help but shudder when he thought of this. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that this was the truth based on the little girl's usual behavior. He immediately made up his mind to not let the little witch continue to learn magic. Otherwise, he might one day be fried by a fireball from behind. At this time, there were only a few people left at the entrance of the tomb. Most of the others had retreated. Brando immediately gestured to the rest of the people, indicating that they should hurry up and leave. He then rushed to the entrance of the tomb. The others probably saw that their lord was out of danger, so they all retreated. But at this moment Brando, who had rushed to the entrance of the tomb, suddenly heard a clear and strange sound behind him. Crack! Instinctively, he felt the hairs on his back standing on end, and he subconsciously moved to the side. He saw a crystal spear flickering with multicolored light shoot past his original position. If he had taken another step forward, then this spear would have undoubtedly opened a bloody hole in his chest. He was almost scared to death. When he looked back, he saw a crystal creature with a glittering crystal body crawling out of the sarcophagus. It looked like a crystal figure. The crystal body vaguely looked like a robe. It was about 5 feet tall and had a strong physique, but it didn't have a head. Brando estimated that if this thing had a head and a neck, it would be considered tall among the Erewhon people. There was no doubt that such a thing could not have been hidden in the sarcophagus. The first thing that came to Brando's mind was the crystal fragments, but he had never seen such a boss in the amber sword before. He couldn't help but feel a little curious. After all, there were few monsters below level 40 that he didn't know. At this moment the thing had completely crawled out of the sarcophagus. Although it was completely made of crystal, its movements were not stiff. Brando estimated that its dexterity was at least 70, which was only half of his. But the sound of the crystal spear piercing through the air made him feel a lingering fear. Its attack power was at least on par with Veronica, when she didn't use her elemental power. This thing was a power-type monster, and it was good at mental attacks. Brando's heart went cold. The data reminded him of something. It had only been a year since he transmigrated to this world. He could still clearly remember the last patch before he transmigrated. The patch after Hopeless Night was called The Earth Awakens. As usual, this expansion pack did not have any introduction. But in the later stages of the Slate War, After the death of the alpha wolf Ekis, Fanzin and Madara fought. The whole world's attention was focused on the battle between the two factions of players. The battle between him and the Orcash Mountains was just the tip of the iceberg of this huge battle. The cause of this battle was simply a competition for resources. An area that had never been set foot in the wilderness of the East was discovered by a group of adventurers. Because of this, the flames of war began. Brendel still remembered the legends of the East, about a new life form that had never been seen before in the wilderness. Crystal clusters. A type of spirit that was 100 times more tenacious than humans and possessed powerful mental powers. But why were there crystal clusters here? This was not 100 years later, nor was it in the distant East. This was Erewhon within the borders of civilization. Even though I'm not sure if Vaunt had crystal clusters 100 years ago, especially in Aween's borders, the game designer must have buried them a little too long. This is the first version of the game, and it's nearly 10 years in the real world. I'm not sure if crystal clusters existed in Vaunt, especially in Aween. But with this doubt, he still pulled out Halrangaya. This was because the crystal monster had already stretched out its hands towards him. Another crystal spike whizzed towards him. At this moment, Brando saw that the spike was shot from the back of the monster. He turned his hand and shattered the spike in midair. But this attack made his arm feel slightly numb. Although he had not used the Dark Dragon's Berserk ability, nor did he use the enhancement crystal, it was enough to explain the problem. This monster's attack power was indeed different from Veronica's in her normal state. This further confirmed his previous guess, which was that it was the peak of a level 40 boss. Brando secretly felt that something was wrong. Under normal circumstances, he would be overjoyed to encounter such a boss. Although he had already obtained the loot, the boss's EXP was also much higher than ordinary monsters. Not to mention, a boss would usually have some special alchemy materials that could not be collected normally. But now was not the time. The tomb was shaking and could collapse at any time. But the monster did not seem to want to let him leave safely. Brando knew that this was part of the dungeon's design. But this monster's attack power was strong and its agility was not bad. If it tried its best to keep him here, it would not be fun. Even if the monster's mental attacks were ineffective against him, it would not be easy for him to kill this monster. Moreover, judging from the monster's previous performance, its intelligence was not too bad. Please don't play with me. You'll be crushed to death, right? He could not help but whisper to the monster. At the same time, he carefully retreated along the shaky tunnel. Seeing that the tomb's door was right in front of him, he was about to heave a sigh of relief. But he did not expect the monster to suddenly pounce on him like a madman. F***CK. Brando could not help but immediately activate charge. His whole body turned into a meteor and shot out of the tomb. The monster seemed to have expected this and suddenly stopped. It let out a resonating cry, and the entire crypt began to vibrate. Brendel saw a flash of white light in front of him, and a thick crystal wall appeared in front of the tomb's door. His heart sank. He knew that if he wanted to escape, he would have to kill the monster first. Brando cursed and turned back to face the monster. But he did not expect the monster to stop after casting its spell. It looked at Brando. Brando was sure that the monster was looking at him. Although it did not have a head or eyes, he felt like he was being watched. The monster looked at him for a moment, then retreated. Brendel saw it climb up the sarcophagus again, then jump down. Then he jumped down. Then it disappeared. Brando was sure that the sarcophagus was not deep enough to cover the monster. He was stunned for a moment. Then he reacted. There's a secret passage. Brendel immediately understood what the monster was trying to do. It wanted to trap him and kill him here. Of course, it was not the first time he encountered such a cunning boss. But this monster wanted to trick him. He could not accept it. Did it think that he was still a newbie? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 506. Have you ever seen a waterfall of mud and gravel? Brando was lucky enough to experience it himself. There was no place to stand, and he was about to be buried in the belly of the mountain. He had no way out, and it was as if he was in a desperate situation. The monster completely disappeared under the sarcophagus. He cursed, raised the Haurangaya with both hands and swung it upwards. A crescent-shaped sword aura split the earth and stones and rushed towards the stone platform in the center. Although the sword aura was not as amazing as the White Raven sword art, it could cover a distance of 10 feet in an instant. "Rise!" Brando roared, and the magic power on the Haurangaya vibrated from the bottom of the dimension. A loud noise like a sharp sword tearing the ground apart, and a row of rock teeth emerged from the loose earth and stones in a straight line. These stone pillars supported the ceiling and blocked the earth and stones from sliding to the center, opening a safe path for Brando. The Haurangaya was also known as the Scepter of Rocks. According to legend, the person who held this scepter could command the earth. Of course, the reality was not so exaggerated, but the underground was no doubt its home ground. The tomb that was on the verge of collapse temporarily stabilized, but only temporarily. Fine cracks had appeared on the stone pillars. Brando looked back at the crystal wall that was shining with colorful light and hesitated. The Chaos Crystal Wall was a spell that could not be broken in a few seconds. He immediately turned around and rushed to the stone platform in the center. Brando climbed up the sarcophagus. The bottom of the huge trapezoidal container had opened, and a mysterious underground passage appeared in front of him. Because there was no fire, the passage was dark, and the stairs seemed to lead to the legendary scorching abyss under Jorgendy Ridge. In an instant there was a dense cracking sound behind him, and the stone pillars were collapsing. Brando did not dare to think too much. He gritted his teeth and jumped into the sarcophagus. The outside of the tomb had completely collapsed, and the ceiling was like a funnel that came in contact with the ground. A huge gust of wind blew in from the outside, causing Brendel to be unable to open his eyes. Then there was a deafening roar that shook the ground, and the whole world was completely silent. The fire was completely extinguished, and the torches in the tomb outside were extinguished by the sand. Brando fell into a pitch-black darkness. Vigilantly, he swept Haurangaya in front of him to prevent the monster from launching a sneak attack. However, there was nothing around him. The monster seemed to know that it was no match for him and had fled far away. Brando could not help but spit. "That's why I hate fighting intelligent monsters." The perception of a warrior who had entered the realm of gold was 10 times better than an ordinary person. Even if there was no light, he could still accurately feel the fluorite in his pocket. Raising the small stone, the dim light illuminated a narrow space around it. It was the underground of the underground. The top of the sarcophagus had been completely sealed, and a large amount of soil and stones had even poured into the secret passage. He first used his sword to poke upwards, but the soil and stones were stacked together tightly, and it seemed that there was no chance of digging out. Brando cursed again in a low voice. "Damn it, the Shire, are you there?" There was no distance on the other side of the soul, but there was a moment of silence. After a moment, the voice of the young mage servant sounded. "Ba. This place." "I'm here, my lord, are you okay? Where are you?" What followed was a series of questions. Brando looked up at the narrow space. The man-made tunnel was narrow and rough, like the perfunctory work of a careless craftsman. "I don't know, I should still be under the tomb. How's the situation outside?" Fortunately, only part of the tomb collapsed and blocked the way. "Miss Scarlet and the others are trying to find a way to open a path." "What about the others?" "Everyone is fine, no one is hurt. Miss Roman is also fine. She is roasting mushrooms." "Roasting mushrooms?" Brando was stunned. "Cough. She found some graveyard moss. She can even eat that." Brando was a little inexplicably surprised, but he was also relieved. The little girl was full of vitality, and it seemed that there was no big problem. "Let her be." Brando sighed and decided to indulge the girl who claimed to be a great merchant. The Shire did not say that Miss Roman was roasting mushrooms for his lord. Instead, he asked, "By the way, I still have the spoils in the sarcophagus. There are a lot of things. My lord, why don't you find a way to summon me? Maybe I can help." Brendel chuckled. He could hear the concern in his squire's voice, but he replied in an exasperated tone. "It's still afternoon, and there are at least 10 more hours until the reset phase. If you're feeling dizzy, go rest. How far is it from the surface?" I think it should be very close. My lord, I have always been quite confident in my ability to escape." "It's not worth bragging about," Brando thought. Then you should find a way to get out as soon as possible and contact the people outside. Good plan. But wait, my lord, how can I get out as soon as possible? The Shire immediately shouted. You are a wizard. Do you need me to teach you this kind of thing? Sorcerers aren't omnipotent, especially a pitiful law researcher like me. My lord, you may not know, but in private, the people of the Silver Alliance call us scholars. Well, I mean, it's not a bad title, but what do you want a weak and pitiful person like me to do? I'm not one of those violent elementalists whose brains are full of muscles. Brando was a little speechless. This guy was actually acting cute. As he lifted the fluorite, the faint light spread down along the rough rock wall, reflecting a downward spiral space. He held his sword tightly in one hand and was about to go down to take a look, but the voice in his mind became clear again. Wait, my lord. Did you find something new on your side? The Shire shouted. Brando stopped. How did you know? I guessed. My lord, do you remember the box I took last? It was a trap. It would have been better if the box was not mentioned. Once it was mentioned, Brando was angry. This guy actually had the nerve to say it. He was about to explode when he heard his wizard squire hurriedly add, My lord, wait. I was going to say that the box was empty. You tricked me with an empty box. You're a disgrace to all the wizards. Brendel said in annoyance. Well, it was an accident, but the situation is not like this. That box was a planeswalker's personal belongings. I recognized the symbol on it. The triangle and the inscribed circle represent the stable iron law and the internal balance. The flame outside is the black flame of Echelon. This box must have something to do with Kelsey. You are not going to tell me that this is his tomb, are you? Brando's eyelids twitched. Something like that. I suspect that there is something else under this tomb. No matter how mysterious it is only a level 40 dungeon. Brando did not say this out loud. However, he also suspected that there was something related to the planeswalker under the tomb. He had a faint connection in his heart. Thinking of this, he remembered to take out the cards in his hand and look at them under the fluorescent light. 5 cards. The first card was drawn with the image of a spellcaster in the fog. A slender silhouette was formed in the hazy fog. However, it had 4 hands, slender and powerful. 3 of the hands were raised high to weave a spell, while the other hand pointed forward. A large army was advancing in the fog. Echelon Spellweaver, Paradise of Adversity X, 7 Dark. Creature, Echelon Spellweaver, Level 25 Elite. Effect: tap, pay 5% of HP, gain 1 light. The Eye of Arrow. A wizard close to the Peak of Silver. However, the effect was similar to a land card and there was no maintenance cost. Brando thought that the more of these cards the better. Then he took out the second card. This card was drawn in an abstract way with a man in a long robe. The man held his head with both hands and looked like he had a migraine. The name of the card was Anxiety Disorder. Its effect was a mess. Anxiety Disorder, Paradise of Adversity 7, 2 Energy. Spell Instant. Effect: copy the effect of a spell that costs no more than 30 HP. For every spell used in this turn, copy the spell once. Time is like gravel passing by in a hurry. Upon seeing this card, Brando could not help but curse in his heart. Although he hadn't fully figured out what the card's description meant, from the literal meaning, it was at least the kind of thing that, although I don't understand it, it seems very powerful. But what was this 2 energy? He was stunned for a moment and suddenly remembered something. The green text on his retina swept across and a card appeared in his vision. Echelon's Furnace of Adversity, Paradise of Adversity 3, 30 Dark. Barrier effect. When the furnace enters the field, attach it to the land card. Tap any 2. Sacrifice an Echelon soldier to gain 2 energy points for the furnace. When a traveler passes through the Great Plains, the Lutsai volcano in the north is shrouded in dark clouds all day long. Damn, it really is a set of cards. Brando muttered in his heart, wondering where he could find so many Echelon soldiers to sacrifice. As he was thinking, he took out the next card. He was slightly stunned when he saw that it was another Echelon Spellweaver in his hand. Brando's expression changed slightly. He quickly flipped over all the cards below. An Echelon Spellweaver followed by another. He was instantly stunned. The remaining cards were all the same Echelon Spellweaver. Even if it was a prophecy, it did not have to be like this, right? This was the first time he had obtained 4 of the same cards in the same place. This made Brando think of a possibility. Perhaps the cards in this tomb were really a complete set? Just as he was thinking, a slight noise came from below the tunnel. Who's there? Brando immediately pointed his sword in that direction. He saw something flash in the darkness in front of him. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation.